8, AT&T Uverse Channel 99, and is being recorded to be replayed on the following Monday and Friday at 1 p.m. on Charter Channel 71 and Comcast Channel 25. Meetings can also be viewed from the city's website at www.cityofcapitola.org. Our technician tonight is Victor Herman, who's sitting in a overheated room back there, cubicle, helping us out. And as a reminder, please turn off your cell phones during the meeting. And if you do choose to come up and speak at the podium tonight, we ask that you sign the sheet when you check in and let us know your name. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started with oral communications.
No additions or deletions to the agenda from staff.
I guess that's it. Except for we do not have minutes to approve for the special agenda. And this is the time for public comments, and this is an item that would not be on our agenda for this evening. If you would like to come up and speak on an item that isn't on the agenda, we'll give you a few minutes to do that. Okay, seeing nobody, we'll go ahead and move this to commission comments.
I just have one, and I'll make it twice this meeting and the next meeting. The Capitola Historical Museum new exhibit is now open. They'll be having their grand opening event on March 19th at noon. The exhibit is an excellent exhibit on Ravnos photographs. So if you get a chance, they have changed their open days. They are now going to be open on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. They will no longer be open on Wednesday, but they're open on those dates from noon to 4 o'clock.
Great. Thanks. Anybody?
I do. I have an announcement to make as well. The new Capitola Friends of the Library branch is having a 16th birthday party for the Capitola Library. It's going to be held on Saturday, March 26th from 12 to 2 at the branch library. It's a family-friendly entertainment and refreshments party with birthday cake, a book bunny, and Pinky the 3D printer, and more, which we have not identified yet. But it will be to sign people up for the new Capitola Library Friends group, to inform people about the ballot measure in June regarding the libraries, and to show the new renderings for our Capitola Library. So we encourage everybody to come by and join the Friends group. Thank you.
So what was the date of the birthday party? I missed that.
This is March 26th. It's a Saturday.
March 26th. Thank you. No, I don't have any comments. Thank you.
Okay, and with that, then there are no minutes to approve, as we mentioned, and we also do not have anything on our consent calendar, so we'll move to item number 5, which is a public hearings, and this special meeting is going to be to discuss our zoning code update. So with that, we'll go ahead and have a staff report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From staff's perspective, we're very happy and pleased to be here tonight. It's an exciting milestone on this long project that we've had. As you are all aware, but for the benefit of the public, we have met with each of the commissioners individually prior to tonight to get some kind of give you an orientation of the changes that have been made and also to receive some preliminary feedback. We really appreciated the amount of work that the commissioners have put in. We got a lot of good comments, clarifications, things that we frankly missed. Some of the things were more substantial policy issues, and then there were a lot of more minor clarifications and typos. Staff will present all of the suggested edits that we received from you individually and put it into the public record at the next meeting so that the public is aware of some of the changes that we're looking at. The goal through the process, at least from staff's perspective, is to do a real thorough, deliberate, but efficient process. I think the goal, the main objective, is to produce a high-quality zoning code that's more user-friendly, not only for staff and the commissioners, but the general public who may not be as familiar with how zoning works. So Katie's going to offer a presentation which is going to highlight 12 issues that either represent topics that did not have unified consensus either between the planning commissioners, the city council, or between the bodies, or areas where we made modifications that we did not discuss during the issues and options presentation. She's going to do in a little different format tonight than we did in the issues and options process. Rather than stopping at each of the issues, she's going to and discussing. So go through a presentation, then we'll open it up for general discussion. The commission can certainly present any topics that they wish to discuss, whether it was one of those 12 or something entirely different. And again, for the benefit of the members of the public, tonight's agenda is a little different. We're going to have a meeting from 6 to 7 o'clock on the zoning code. We will then continue our zoning code discussion at 7 o'clock. We will have our regular scheduled meeting. We'll close that meeting, and at the Commission's will, we'll resume discussion of the zoning code items. One item that isn't in Katie's presentation but became clear during our discussions with you is that I think we should have some discussion tonight about what your expectations are for going through the zoning code in the following hearings. You know, how much detail do we want to give? How fast or slow do we want to go? What are the level of detail we want to go? That direction would be very helpful for staff tonight. So with that, I'll turn it over to Katie. Thank you.
Can I just ask then, when will that discussion happen?
I would encourage it to happen tonight so that we get some type of,
At what point tonight?
At what point tonight?
it can be before, you know, we adjourn at 7 o'clock, or it can be after.
I would like to have it be first up.
That would be fine.
Okay, let's do that. Sounds like you have some thoughts, so we'll
I
just
do
start off
have
with
some
you.
thoughts, I do have some thoughts. You know, I really feel like this process has been a good one. It's involved a lot of the public, and we've gone about it very deliberately. We had joint meetings with the city council. We've just spent hours and hours, and staff, Lord knows, staff has spent hours and hours on this. And I feel all the way up until now, we've done really well. And I do take exception to the way that the staff has presented this portion of the review of the zoning code. I think from my cursory look, there's so many changes in it that, for me, this pulling out different sections here and there feels very disjointed. I would prefer, for myself, I don't know if there's any support with the rest of the commissioners, I would really prefer that we started at square one. We started the first thing, and we not necessarily read it word for word. We would certainly read it word for word, the sections that we knew we were going to review that night. But we come back and we talk about those sections, and we work from the front to the back of it. And I think the public, it will make more sense for the public, too. And certainly, it will make me understand this code better, so that when a member of the public comes to me and says, what were you thinking, you guys? What were you thinking when you did that? I can say, I remember the discussion about that, and I remember it was during that evening, and it was regarding that whole section, and it just makes more sense to me. I don't know what the rest of the commissioners feel.
You want to go? Okay. I felt just disjointed as well, because my systematic way that I jumped into the code was to start at a place and then jump back and forth with all the sections that were included in that. But I don't have a problem going through these items because they're real meaty. And when we get through the way that staff has proposed we look at it, we have that opportunity to stop and step back and go all the way through and make sure that we've touched it all. I hadn't considered not doing it this way until you brought it up, so I'm not very articulate about it, but I think they've done a lot of work on these, and I think we should hear the presentation and let them go through that.
I wouldn't mind hearing the presentation tonight. I think my preference would be after tonight, we start at the beginning and go through it. My concern with going through these each time like this is that it just seems disjointed. I don't know how it relates to other parts of the document, and
I was going through a lot of the notes that I had from our discussions before, and I did find that there were things included here that weren't covered in my notes, and I was wondering if I was going to find more of that, going through here. But I agree, it's disjointed doing it.
I think there's a lot in here that we didn't discuss, and I'm not saying it's bad. I just think, the community deserves to have it discussed.
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement. My approach would be tonight would be to go ahead and listen to Katie's presentation, because I think there are some meaty issues. We did advertise that, those items were going to be talked about tonight. But it would be helpful for us to start in the beginning of the code and say, we're going to do this many chapters at our next meeting and just work our way through it. Because I agree, I think there's, a lot of information that sort of goes back and forth. One example I would use is that, you read the whole section on the CR zone, and then later in the document, there's a section about residential in CR that's not in that section. So unless you read the whole code, you really don't know everything about any one particular district. And for me, and I spent a long time meeting with staff, and I think you guys have done a great job. There are just a lot of issues. I think we need to verbalize so the public is aware of the changes that are in there. And as planning commissioners, I think it's part of our sort of responsibility to go through the whole thing in detail and make certain it's right. I also, and we can talk about this a little later, have a couple questions about the process, about once we finish our review and this goes to the city council. It's my understanding from actually talking to another city attorney, not Capitola's, that this is just like any other ordinance that goes to the council, and if the council makes any significant changes, then it needs to come back to us. So this is one time where, the Planning Commission doesn't just do its work and then turn it over to the council, and then the council does what they want to do with it. It's really a more collaborative work product that we're both going to participate in.
So thanks. And I know the group feels this way, that it's a unsurmountable amount of work that you folks have done here, and so it's a lot to cover. And I think maybe we started down this path because process-wise, it's how we started writing those. It seems like we took different groups. The ones that were really, had discussion topics, we kind of stayed on. And quite frankly, I don't know that by going straight from the front to the back is going to make it any more disjointed, because everything's got a parking section under it, and then you're going to jump to the parking thing. So, but I'm willing to try whatever you guys want to do. I think either way, it requires, what I noticed I had to do is when we got into certain areas, I had to reference other sections that we're not reviewing tonight just to understand that. So,
I know this is a little out of order, but if I could make one more comment before we close on this. The other process that we're doing that I think is will work really well. As Rich said, he met with each of us, or they met with each of us individually, and we talked about issues and concerns that we had, and some minor and some major. Some of those changes don't really need a lot of discussion. They just need publishing. So if we continue to do that, and they put that list together, and we all get to review it and pull items that we want to pull, otherwise a lot of stuff gets folded in as they get it.
Right. I agree. I think that this is probably, in my opinion, the biggest task the city has undertaken as far as planning is concerned in 25 years. And I think it's a huge task to come up with a whole new zoning ordinance for the city. But I think it's also important that we make certain that we go through it at a pace so that we're comfortable and we understand it, and we're comfortable that the community has had an opportunity to hear us discuss it, come down and participate if they would like to in the discussions. But it's not something that I see that we want to rush through. This one we do need to take our time on.
Rich, would you have any more comments on suggestions or?
In response to Commissioner Smith's comments, I would say that, you know, the intention with some of the feedback we received, what we were thinking of doing was kind of separating it into, you know, kind of policy issues that have substantial changes, and then maybe a section where it's typos, clarifications, word choice, things like that. And then as we move through the code, we'll start doing changes and track changes so that they're readily available and clear to anybody that looks at the code. And I would also echo a lot of the sentiments I just heard, that I think it's our collective responsibility to engage the community, make sure they understand it. And if the commission wants to take a bit of a more methodical approach, I think that's perfectly appropriate. We're here to serve. What we may ask is that we condense hearing schedules so that we don't protract the overall process schedule too much. And at some point, you know, something that I'm going to have to think about is how do we engage the city council, and I'll work with the city manager and the mayor to figure that out. When is the appropriate times to bring them in? Because if this is something that takes a few months, I think we want to keep them engaged, keep those ideas in their mind. They're going to want to know what's going on through the commission hearings, and maybe to avoid some of the back and forth, if there are changes that Commissioner Westman brought up, you know, we might start having a back and forth a little bit. But those are details we can certainly work out as we go through the process.
So then, for this evening, we'll go through it, the staff report that Katie has. We'll have this discussion of the topics that were published for tonight, and then for our next special meeting, we'll look at maybe going through a fashion from the front to the back. Is that all right? Does that work?
Great, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for that. And Katie, we'll go ahead and listen.
Okay, thank you, Commission. So first off is tonight is our first special hearing on March 3rd. We also have a special hearing scheduled for March 17th, and we will be drafting, as we just said, a new outline of dates for you for the further review of the document. Just a brief overview of the layout of the code. There's 5 sections to the code. The first is enactment and applicability. It ties your zoning map to the zoning code. Part 2 is your zoning districts and overlay districts. Within that, it's the development standards are very specific to each zone. Any standards that are applicable citywide, such as accessory structures or parking, are included in Part 3 of the citywide standards. So it's very important to realize when you're going through land use tables and there's references to other sections of code, it most likely lives in the citywide standards, and that's where you would see those standards that are applicable to all zones. Part 4 is permits and administration, and this is one of the big improvements within the code of outlining the process for the general public. When they look at the document, it's very clear what steps they have to take in order to get a permit and to appeal a permit, if so be. And Part 5 is the glossary and terms. On this slide, you can see the new zoning map. The major changes included are changes in the land use designations found in the general plan land use map. For example, the split of the commercial area designations in the general plan land use map into regional and community commercial areas are now divided within our commercial area on the zoning map. Also, yes.
Do you have, I know it's taken me years to be able to read this map, and I'm sure people here and at home don't really know what you're talking about. Do you have a pointer or?
Yep. So here's your the new regional commercial area in red. This 41st Avenue used to all be CC zoning for community commercial. Community commercial is now in pink here, and also up on Bay Avenue. But this is a new regional commercial center, which reflects the change that was in the land use map and the general plan. Another change is we had several different mixed-use districts that extended along Capitola Road, and also the neighborhood commercial district that came down Capitola Avenue. We've had 3 different mixed-use districts that were combined into one neighborhood mixed-use for the future. And other changes that took place were errors within the zoning map, such as, let's see where my clicker is. There's on Opal Cliffs, there's a multi-tenant condominium that used to be designated on the zoning code as single family, and that's been changed to multifamily and at the correct density as has been built. One modification to the land use map that I noticed yesterday is that the small sliver of parcel in front of the Marnock Cove Inn, it was open space in the past, and we plan to put that back to open space. For some reason in the mapping, it was switched to visitor serving. One other change is there were a couple instances attached to your, I think it was Exhibit 3, that was a list of changes that occurred in the zoning map. There's one parcel at 3945 Melton Street. This is located behind Verrudi's Liquor Store across from the O'Neill. The building behind the liquor store is a single-family home, but it's owned by the same owner as the liquor store. I've reached out to any single-family homeowners that were affected by the zoning code update, and in conversations with the owner here, they'd like it to remain as community commercial because in the future they foresee themselves redeveloping the entire site. So that's one change that, a second change that we'll make within the land use map, the zoning map to date. But those are the only two that have come to my attention since publishing. So the second topic is development standards in mixed-use zones. The new zoning map consolidates the existing commercial residential district, the neighborhood commercial district, and the professional office district into one neighborhood mixed-use district. It also converts the central village zone into the village mixed-use zone. There's no change to the boundary, just the name. And so from these changes, 4 zones were condensed down to 2 zones. The new code, the current code does not include standards for parcel area, parcel width, and parcel depth in the mixed-use districts. The new code would include minimum parcel dimension standards for each zone, which would apply only if a property owner was requesting a subdivision. These standards would not affect any legal lots of record. And that question's come up a bit, so I'm going to make that clear, and we'll also clarify that in the language within the code. Next, the development standards for the mixed-use zones have been updated in the new code to relate to the existing code with increased guidance. The current setback standards in the central village are extremely flexible. There's an open space requirement and minimal setback requirements within that zone. The current setback standards in the central village are extremely flexible, and the new draft code maintains the flexible standards of the village district within the MUV district. The development standards of the existing CR, CN, and PO districts have been increased separation of buildings with established minimum setbacks on all sides. Within the new mixed-use neighborhood district, these development standards have been included with new front yards to ensure adequate spacing for sidewalks geared towards walkable mixed-use communities, while also maintaining that there is increased separation between the buildings. So within the village, the buildings will remain tighter, and in your mixed-use neighborhood districts, there'll be greater separation between buildings, giving a different feel. Exceptions have also been added for those areas within the mixed-use neighborhood district that have an established pattern of buildings being closer to the street or closer together, such as right across the street from City Hall along Capitola Avenue between the Trestle and Blue Gum. Next, there's new design standards included in the mixed-use districts. Under the existing code, the Central Village zone is subject to the 1987 Central Village Development Design Standards. At the direction of the Planning Commission and City Council during the issues and options hearings, the 1986 guidelines will be rescinded with the adoption of the new code, and relevant design guidelines were to be incorporated into the code. So the new code does incorporate new standards reflective of the previous design guidelines to assist in building placement and articulation. The new design standards modernize the previous guidelines and utilize the term shall, signifying the standards are required. We expect more discussion on this evening, on whether or not the design standards should be encouraged, using the word should, or if they shall be required, and the term to remain shall within this section. Topic 3 was for required parking in the mixed-use neighborhoods. Within the review of the issues and options, we were told to keep the parking standards within the village the same, so those did stay the same, and also to take a kind of a district approach of unique parking standards for each commercial district within town. So within the one area in which the standards were decreased were in the neighborhood mixed-use zoning district to reflect the ability for residents to walk to destinations since they are within neighborhoods. The changes are shown in this table. So the only changes that were increased within the zoning code in the mixed-use neighborhood are shown here. For retail, an increase to 400 square feet, one space per 400 square feet, and then for restaurants as well, the changes occurred. Next is one of our recurring themes of the 6-seat rule for takeout establishments. The existing code requires one parking space for 240 square feet of retail use and restaurant takeout establishments with 6 or fewer seats. The necessary oversight by the city staff to monitor the 6-seat maximum within restaurants has been an ongoing enforcement issue. The draft code creates a new land use category, takeout food and beverage. The draft code defines the takeout food and beverage as an establishment where food and beverage may be consumed on the premises, taken out, or delivered, but where the area open to the customer is limited to no more than 160 square feet. So when a development comes in that has 160 square feet, it can be that's accessible to the public. It can be designated a to-go restaurant and therefore have a parking established at one space for 240 square feet. So this allows small establishments within the village or throughout town to convert from retail to a small to-go restaurant without increasing the necessary parking. We did have our intern go around and look at all the to-go restaurants within Capitola and assess what is the area open to the public. And as you can see here, the Pizza My Heart is at 44 square feet. Calypso, the coffee shop right down the street, is at 160. That's where the standard is at today within the code. Other restaurants are listed. And this evening we could talk about increasing that number to include more of the restaurants that exist if the Planning Commission directed us to bump that number up to 300 square feet. 5 of the 6 to-goes would be compliant under the new code. Whereas where it's proposed today, only 2 of the 6 existing restaurants are compliant. Next, we'll talk about the new on-site parking alternatives. This is topic 5. Within the parking alternatives, valet parking is one. There's a reference to valet parking in the current code to designate valet parking spaces within the central village. The previous code does not have any standards tied to that allowance. The new code includes standards to valet parking with a maximum of 25% reduction of required parking. Staff must be attended, and we'll add language to say when open, so it's not attended at all times. Designated drop-off and pickup areas. The Planning Commission must approve such a valet plan. Parking demand study is required with sign-off by the Community Development Director and Public Works, and no interference with vehicles or pedestrians. Another new on-site parking alternative is low demand. In this option, a parking study would be required that identifies the land use will not utilize the required parking that's required by the code. The study would be reviewed by the Community Development Director and Public Works. Final approval of the reduction for a low demand land use for parking is approved by the Planning Commission. Next is a Transportation Demand Management Plan, known as a TDMP. In a TDMP, the employer identifies specific acceptable measures to reduce demand on parking. A good example is an employee shuttle. With an acceptable TDMP, a business can receive up to a 15% reduction in parking. The employer must track the success and report to the Planning Commission. This option is only available to employers that have 25 or more employees. This allowance can be further limited to exclude the underparked zoning districts, such as the village, from participating in a TDMP. Shared parking. So I should note that the shared parking alternative is an off-site parking alternative. We were discussing on-site prior. At the direction received during the issues and options review, the shared parking allowance excludes residential land uses. So within a shared parking, the parking demand study is required to make a finding of no substantial conflict, and the shared parking must be within 400 feet of a primary residence. This maximum, we could also tie a maximum deduction limit to shared parking. So if you wanted to say that within a shared parking study, no more than 20% of a reduction would be allowed, that can be something that's added. Also, you can limit where shared parking district studies are allowed within the city. So again, in under parked areas such as the village, if you didn't want to have shared parking allowed, we could exclude it from the village. And then the in lieu, the draft code includes provisions for an in lieu parking program, which reflects the adopted city council policy that's been adopted. New standards are including limiting the in lieu program to mixed use village zone only and non-residential uses. Approval is required by the city council. Okay, so that wraps up all the on-site parking incentives. Next topic is incentives for community benefits. This is a new chapter within the draft code to provide defined standards for what qualifies as an acceptable community benefit, which can be considered to increase floor area ratio as provided in the general plan, a planned development project, or increased height in commercial zones as prescribed in the existing zoning code. This slide lists the qualified community benefits. The draft code includes a description of each of these benefits. Next, the code outlines the available incentives of increased floor area ratio up to 2. This reflects the allowance established within the new general plan. Also, the code includes a maximum height increase up to 50 feet. The current zone allows for additional height but does not have an established limit, so this will put a new limit to what that increased height can be. On the bottom of the slide, you can see what the existing zone development standards are within the community commercial zone and regional commercial zone. Topic number 7 is nonconforming structures. As you will recall, the existing code requires that nonconforming structures come into conformity based on an 80% threshold of existing value. This standard is hard to administer. The draft code implements a new threshold for substantial demolitions based on 50% of lineal footage of walls and floor area. So once 50% or more of the lineal footage of the existing interior or exterior walls are removed, or 50% or more of the existing floor, ceiling, and roof structures are removed, then it would be considered a substantial demolition and would have to come into compliance with the current code. Another section of this is the non-conforming, the allowance for the replication of non-conforming single-family dwellings. Within this section of the code, a single-family dwelling that's non-conforming can be replicated. It's not eligible if it's going to be expanded in any way or increased. Deviations to reduce the nonconformity would be allowed within this standard, and also no additions could take place or modifications to increase mass, floor area, or height for up to 10 years. In reviewing this and taking a step back and looking at our code, looking at the substantial deviations at 50% and then the allowance for a replication of a single-family home to be replicated 100%, there seems to be an advantage to just tearing a home down and completely replicating it, and an incentive built within the code. This is something that we think deserves more discussion of what are the impacts of these two side by side within the code, and the possibility of removing the substantial demolition 50% rule, because the code is very clear that nonconforming structures cannot be increased, or the nonconformity of the structure cannot be increased. You can add on in those areas where it meets setbacks and height, so by removing the substantial demolition, you could be ensured that the nonconformity would not get any larger or more severe, but it takes away this kind of loophole that's kind of built into the code with this standard. Okay, the next is topic 8, permanent outdoor displays. The existing code allows outdoor displays within the central village with a conditional use permit. Otherwise, the code is silent to outdoor displays. The code lacks any site or design standards for outdoor displays. The draft code addresses this deficiency. The draft code requires a conditional use permit within the mixed-use village zone and an administrative permit in all other zoning districts, as long as the new display complies with all the regulations. The code includes new standards for height, size, permitted goods, hours, and screening. The displays must be located on the commercial property and not within the sidewalk or public right-of-way. Also, there are design standards included to ensure that the outdoor display complement the existing built conditions, are made of quality materials, that they are maintained, and that they do not violate the sign code. A similar topic is topic 9, temporary sidewalk dining, also influential on the outside of a commercial building. The existing code allows outdoor dining in the central village on private property with a conditional use permit. The code does not include any specific review criteria for dining areas. The draft code introduces new standards for outdoor dining within sidewalks and public right-of-ways. We are seeing this trend throughout destination communities to activate and engage visitors along the street. The new code requires an administrative permit and an encroachment permit for a sidewalk dining. The new standards allow for sidewalk dining along the restaurant frontage as long as, they allow for sidewalk dining along the restaurant frontage as long as ADA and other standards for furniture, signs, trash, food, maintenance, and hours of operation are met. Also included in this portion of the code is a new allowance for conversions of on-street parking spaces, aka parklets, to outdoor dining with Planning Commission approval of a conditional use permit and encroachment permit. This standard was at the request of our stakeholder outreach group and has become a common trend in visitor-serving destinations. The design of the on-street dining decks cannot exceed 2 parking spaces and must relate to the primary building. Also within this allowance, there are specific findings that must be in compliance. The next topic, topic 10, is the Design Review Committee. This one's pretty straightforward. There's a new name associated with the Arc and Site Committee within the new code. It would be the Design Review Committee. There'll be one new member assigned to the community, which is a second architect. The second architect is a consultant selected by the Community Development Director. This consultant would participate on multifamily projects, non-residential projects, and significant projects as determined by the Community Development Director. Otherwise, the function and the membership stays the same. Topic 11 is minor modifications. This standard is new to the code and a result of recent applications in front of the Planning Commission. The new minor modification is proposed to allow the Planning Commission to approve projects which require a little bit of flexibility from the strict application of certain development standards when variance findings cannot be made. The process would allow up to a 10% deviation from physical development standards that apply to a property, including height, setbacks, and parking dimensions. The draft specifically excludes minor modifications to lot area, width, and depth, minimum off-street parking requirements, residential density, and floor area ratio. The Planning Commission takes action on minor modification applications. And next is topic 12, changes to approved plans. And this is also something that's come up during the review that we've been bringing back plans that have a minor change, bring it back to the Planning Commission, where our previous code did not define when that needs to occur. This is a new provision to address issues with the process of authorized post-approval changes to projects. This section establishes a procedure for the Community Development Director to approve minor changes to approved projects if the request changed compliance with the new review criteria. Changes which exceed the standards set within the draft code would be considered by the Planning Commission or the review authority that last approved it. So with that, that concludes the 12 topics that we thought would be a good start for discussion. I've listed them on this slide, and we could maybe discuss which items you would like to discuss tonight, and I can note that, and we'll go back to them.
Yeah. So as you can see, we have a lot of discussion here. There's a lot of people I'm guessing is not here for our regular plan meeting, but for our ordinance discussion. So we have 15 minutes left on the clock before we switch meetings. So I'd like to open this up for public discussion now. If you have anything you'd like to discuss, it's one of these 12 items, and we can discuss that and take some information down. And we're going to, how many of you are here to speak tonight? Anybody? Do I have a raise of hands? One or two? Okay, so we can give you 3 minutes or so, and then we can take it back from there. So we'll go ahead and open up for a public discussion if one of you wants to come up and tell us what you have information or concerns about. Thank you, and if you can just give us your name and write it down on the podium there, we'd appreciate it.
Sure. Hi, my name's Ed Berwick. I'm actually a Los Altos resident, but we have a house here. We've rented here for a decade and bought about 3 years ago. A house near Union Bank, near Gales, that area. And I think this is in the, oh God, I don't have the cue card up there, but the multi-use district thing, multi-use
village.
Basically, basically what, you've got a certain segment of the area that only allows for one night's rentals and Airbnb style stuff. What I'm going to talk about is safety and security in all kinds of zones, including Depot Hill, our area, what have you. My dog and I have been walking the neighborhoods at night for over a decade, and you can readily see which houses are vacant. And, you know, there's probably 20% of the houses that are vacant in some of the areas. Since we've owned the house that we're in, we've had homeless people peeing in the brushes across the street at Union Bank, peeing in the street in front of our door. We've had homeless people sleeping next to our house. We've had them coming through into closets that didn't have locks. And after a couple of years of this, we spend maybe 4 nights a month at our house here. And I'm sure that there are other people who commute and stay, 1 or 2 nights every so often in Capitola in their owned house. And it's pretty apparent which houses are vacant most of the time. I mean, I do this with my dog every night, and you can tell which houses are vacant. And ours is obviously one of them. And so about 6 months ago, I don't know, I'm not the one who keeps track of this, we started Airbnb-ing because we wanted more use
30
of our
seconds.
house. Okay, anyway, and the point is, it's more security for the neighborhood, it's more security for everyone to have Airbnbs going on all through the Depot Hill, et cetera, our area, because there will be more people spotting the odd stuff and not allowing it. That's all.
Okay, Mr. Berwick, thank you. And that's actually, are we going to hear that again under the transit overlay? Is that for the vacation rental? It's a little bit different than the,
I think that comment can be applied to the zoning map and a request to extend the
okay.
TRO.
Thank you. I'm sorry, sir, what was your name? I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, sir. Your name?
Peter Petru.
Okay, Peter, thank you.
OE, and just for convenience, I wrote in the back.
Thank you.
I guess,
We'll need a copy here, please.
She needs,
For our secretary, there you go, please.
and there's one for the secretary, I guess. Right, is that you?
No, you gave it to her, you're good. Yeah.
Except I think one of them is one copy. I don't know which one's mine. It hasn't-
I've got writing on mine.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Okay, well, that's all right. Good for you. Okay, and I'll write it in afterwards. Okay, my name is Peter Petru, and I don't live in your wonderful city. I used to visit here all the time in the good old days when there was still a lot of young people here all week long, not just on the weekends. And I used to have a great time. Anyway, I looked through this, and you can see there's a couple little errors on page 755 and on page 757. No, 758. You notice it didn't get transferred. But I'm here mostly to talk about visitors serving number R, which is the Rispert Mansion. And I've been talking to City Council for quite a while, for a few years, to make that into a youth hostel, like we have in Santa Cruz. I'm involved in a hostel. I've been there involved for about 30 years or so. And we have a hostel in community cottages, 45 beds. It's been running wonderfully, but it's not large enough. And we turn away about a dozen people a night during the summer weekends. Even more, basically before we had covered about 10,000, at least 10,000 overnights. Visitors and school groups and affinity groups, usually from most of them from overseas, but the school groups and the Girl Scout groups that we put on are mostly from this area or from Central California area someplace. And the Rispert Mansion would be fantastic to have as a hostel, and I'm glad that it would meet most of the guidelines. I added one little section that should be maybe incorporated in the somewhere, I don't know where, and it's the Keene Hostel Act, which says that you can put a hostel anywhere in a city, in parks, state, city, local, county, whatever, and it seems that this would fit, so that would be a great use for that parcel. One of the things I noticed was that the local coastal plan needs to be updated. I mean, the last time it was updated was in 2001, where it mentioned there's 4 motels in Capitola. In Capitola, and that's and that charge anywhere from $20 to $75 a night. I think that's kind of outdated. If you could, I think it's about 3 times as much nowadays. So it seems to me that should be updated, and also there should be more emphasis put on the Coastal Act 30213, which specifies that whenever you build a hotel within the coastal zone, that lower cost visit accommodations be included. Cities normally try to evade that because they want these hotels to be built, and they kind of ignore the law. And that's why I think Mr. Lester, Charles Lester have met his demise on that issue. So anyway,
Thank you, Mr.
Okay,
Stewart.
thanks.
We appreciate that.
Thanks.
Do we have anyone else tonight that would like to talk about our zoning update? No? Okay, if not, then I'll bring it back to the planning commission. We can.
I have a couple of questions for
For staff?
staff
Sure.
after their presentation. I think I heard you say, and I just want to verify, that shared parking is only off-site parking, it's not on-site parking?
Oh,
Or is it both?
On-site.
It's on-site
It's
parking.
on-site parking, okay.
It can be, I think it can be both. I think you can do it, you can share parking off-site if you have an agreement with
Okay.
it.
Can be both, okay, cool. And a parcel size that does not meet the parcel size that we're calling out in the new code does not, what's the impact on that? I mean, it's a non-conforming parcel, but it doesn't have anything to do with the structure itself, correct? So you can be a
Yeah,
conforming
so-
structure on a non-conforming lot?
Yes. Yep.
But they're not considered non-conforming lots.
No, it's just at the time of where it would be considered a non-conforming lot, but
They're an existing lot of record.
lot of record.
Yeah, I think technically it is a non-conforming lot because it doesn't meet current standards. However, it has no effect on a property owner's ability to build and enjoy the property as was allowed during the time the parcel was created. So it really only comes into play if somebody came in with a subdivision, that they need to meet those minimum lot standards and dimensions.
So, any more questions for staff? Would we like to just start at item 1 and zoning map, and we'll just work our way through that until, we have a few minutes here before the regularly scheduled meeting?
So I just have one request. I know that Commissioner Newman was very interested in the MU districts, both the Central Village and the Neighborhood District. And since we're obviously not going to, sort of get through everything tonight, I wonder if it would be possible to save those for our next meeting so that he could participate in that discussion.
I'd be fine with that. I do have a question about it, and I'm sure there's a good reason for it. On the maps, and in the code, you refer to MU-V, but then it's defined as village mixed use, and they're inverted. And I'm wondering why they're inverted. It seems as though it would be better if you're going to say MU-V, you would describe it as mixed use village, both in the code and on the map, so that, I don't know, I'm just trying to make it so that people can read these things.
So I think typical zoning naming conventions will use, like, for instance, an R1, R2, R3, where the residential R comes first, and mixed use, the MU, and then you have sort of a sub-classification. That said, it's something we can certainly change. There's no problem with it.
That's not, it's not a deal breaker for me.
Sure. It might be more intuitive.
Anyway, but
Yeah.
Yeah, because it just seems inconsistent. There's a number of them that, like C-R's, regional commercial, and then community commercial, obviously it doesn't matter, but it seems like if we can make it consistent either way, it would be nice. And I didn't notice on the glossary, but if you're able to look up terms, it's nice to know which one you're doing.
right.
So
Yeah, I
brought
think
that up
it's
too.
mostly in the code that it's going to be useful, I think.
Right.
Yeah, I actually found the MUN and the MUV, having them in the same section of the zoning ordinance to be confusing. It's like you read one paragraph and it's MUV, you read the next paragraph and it's MUN, and it's,
Right.
I almost wondered if we wanted to sort of somehow separate them out and name them differently, because a lot of the standards that we want to have for the Central Village are different than standards we want to have in the, neighborhood commercial. And I was trying to figure out a way for the public, particularly on the Central Village, because we've got, residential overlay down there, we've got to deal with coastal issues in all the village, we've got, the transient overlay district. I just wondered if it was too confusing having those two areas in the same sort of section, if there was some way to, let's talk about Central Village first, and then let's talk about the neighborhood, mixed-use neighborhood second, not have them mixed together.
Right, and your tables, mixing them side by side, you're going back and forth. I did find what I thought was a discrepancy in the tables, too. When we get to that, I'd like to talk about that. But I do agree with that.
I think that's easily accommodated. Maybe it's in the same chapter and section, but there are distinct subsections so that
One can be A,
it's
one
easy
can
to
be
see.
B, something
Right.
to help it.
And then more, on the naming, there's no rules with the naming conventions. We can make them as we choose. In fact, when we reviewed the draft, I think we initially had single-family residential being RSF, and we made the conscious decision, just keep R1, because that's what everyone in Capitola has probably called it for 20, 30 years. So if there's other suggestions like that, we could certainly continue to call the Central Village CV. There would be no problem with that.
I don't have a problem with the abbreviations with, the MU-V, but if the description could be inverted so that it reflects that wording, that's, I'm happy keeping it MUV.
MUV and MUC, or MUV and MUN, I've spent now a couple of weeks trying to pound into my head what they are. So if you're going to change them quick and don't change them again, because I'm finally beginning to get a handle on understanding them. But the mixed use, I think, is important. Whether it's in the village or whether it's neighborhood, it's mixed use. And it's important for those two to be comparable, I think. So in the table, I don't mind seeing them side by side.
And I also think
actually
it more
helpful to me.
clearly talks about what the land use designation is for that area. It's Central Village really doesn't tell you what you can do in it. Mixed use is clearer, I think.
And in the village, you have residential village, right? You have residential areas that are not mixed use allowable.
Right. There's a residential overlay district on the back part of the village where you can't not have mixed use. So I just think that sort of chapter, I don't know how far we want to get into it, and this is the problem of jumping around, because there are a number of comments I have about the mixed-use neighborhood district, some things I think we need to add and some things I think we need to eliminate. So that's sort of one of the confusions that comes up of sort of, not taking things in order.
What I might suggest is at our next meeting that maybe we kick it off with sort of two parts. One may be kind of an orientation. You may have noticed like we added a user's guide to the zoning code, more intended to help the person that doesn't use the zoning code. So if they're in there and they have no idea, there's some kind of reference material for them. And then also to maybe dig a little bit deeper into organization and format, naming conventions, that type of things, because that is all important, how they connect, how it's laid out, how we name things. And that should probably occur towards the front end of discussions, I would think.
On the zoning map, before we have to change, I just want to make one comment, because I did talk to Rich and Katie about it, and I think it is important. On the old zoning map, we had much more letter designations in the colored zones than we have on the new one. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to try and put as many of them back as we can. Mm-hmm. So when it's big, you can clearly see you're not looking at light yellow and dark yellow, or dark yellow and light brown together and trying to figure out, now, what is this?
Right.
So I think they're going to try and put those designations back on there.
Okay. So I think what we'll do is we're going to adjourn our special meeting, and we'll move into our regularly scheduled planning commission meeting.
Commissioner Welch?
Yes. I'm
If you could continue the meeting so that we're not
Rather than
renoticing.
adjourn.
Okay.
Each
Oh,
month.
good. Okay.
And let the folks know that we are going to talk about it again, because we have a very short agenda for our regular meeting. So very soon, we're going
Thank
to
you.
continue talking about this.
So yeah, we will continue the meeting, and we'll move into, let's see if I get the right set of minutes here for the planning commission. We've already done a roll call, pledge of allegiance. 2 new business for tonight.
We need,
I need to switch my video.
Okay.
So just give me one.
So we're not going to do comments or anything.
I think I'm going to go through the whole thing again, but not the, yeah.
In case people are
Is it worse than it was?
Let's go somewhere.
Okay.
We're all set? Okay, so we're going to start off at item 2 with oral communications. Any additions or deletions to the
Mr.
agenda?
Chairman?
Okay, and now we'll move to item 2, which is for public comments. Again, this is for any public comments of things that are not on tonight's agenda. Do we have anybody that would like to speak about items that are not on the agenda? Okay, then we'll move on to commission comments.
Once again, I'm going to bring up the party at the Capitola Branch Library that's being thrown by the new Friends of the Capitola Branch Library. Everyone's invited. It's on Saturday, March 26th, between 12 and 2. There will be cake and beverages. There will be a book bunny. There will be a 3D printer printing out things for kids. It will show, we'll have the new renderings for the library, the initial renderings for the new library. We'll be talking about the library facilities ballot initiative measure, and you'll have a chance to join the Friends group, which is free. So if anybody's interested, we hope that you will show up for that. Birthday party, cake. What's bad about that?
And once again, the museum exhibit for the year is now open, and they're having their grand opening reception on March 19th at 12 o'clock. The exhibit is on Ravnos Photos, and it's really a great exhibit, so if you get a chance to go down. The hours of operation this year have changed somewhat. They're no longer open on Wednesdays. They'll be open Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from noon to 4 o'clock. It's a great little museum, so please do go visit.
Susan, do you have anything?
No, thank you.
Okay, and any staff comments?
No comments.
No? Okay, so we're looking at item 3A, the approval of our minutes from February 4th.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
Motion and second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Moving right along. So now we're at item 4 for our consent calendar. We have one item, 1501 41st Avenue, and the consent calendar is voted in one action. Unless there's somebody that'd like to speak on that or pull that. Do we have anybody like to pull that from tonight's agenda?
I'd move approval of the consent calendar.
Okay, we have a
I'll second it.
first and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, now we're to public hearings, and so we have item 5A, 419 Capitola Avenue, with a conceptual review. And my understanding is that we need to continue this. They've asked for continuance to the March 17th meeting. So because of location, we're going to have to draw straws to see who the lucky individual is that gets to stay.
And while you're drawing straws, I'm going to read the legal.
Oh, thank you.
So, rule of necessity, at the March 5th Planning Commission meeting, public hearing on agenda item 5A, state law prohibits public officials from acting on matters in which they have certain economic interests. 2 planning commissioners have disclosed qualifying conflicts of interest in decisions relating to public hearing item 5A. 2 that are present tonight. There are actually, no, there's 2. Okay. 1 that is present. 2 that are present tonight.
3 total.
1 that is absent, sorry. Under the rule of necessity, a public official may participate in the decision to the extent that participation is legally required. Here, the participation of 1 conflicted commissioner is legally required in order to achieve a quorum and enable the commission to act on this item. Therefore, the commission may invoke the rule of necessity to bring back 1 commissioner as is necessary to have a quorum. The commissioner who will be brought back will randomly be selected by the drawing of straws, which we'll do now.
And the shortest straw will sit on the hearing.
Okay.
I don't care.
Oh.
And so the drawing of straws will also be in effect for our March 17th meeting, so Commissioner,
Okay. The commissioner that randomly selected the shortest straw is Commissioner Westman. Is that correct? Accordingly, Commissioner Westman may participate in this decision under the rule of necessity. The other conflicted commissioners may recuse themselves and leave the room before the discussion of this item begins. Thanks.
great. So this item, we're just going to move to continue the item.
I'll make a motion to continue it to March 17th.
And I'll second that motion.
And all those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so we'll close that, and welcome back. We'll move on to the director's report, and tonight we're going to have a review of the CEQA presentation, is that correct?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a few brief items, and then I will provide a CEQA presentation, and I'll try to move through as quickly as possible. It's a little bit lengthy, but I'll try to make it as brief as I can and then take time for any questions that you might have. March 31st is still our tentative target date for the skate park hearing. So mark your calendars. I'm not able to quite confirm that yet. We're tidying up some loose ends, but it's looking like that's going to be the date that that project is heard. Within 10 days of that hearing, we will post the final environmental impact report to the city website. We'll make it available to the public at the library as well as at City Hall. And then I'll include all the responses to the many comments we received during the EIR public review period. Kind of following up on Commissioner Ortiz's news about the library, the city did complete a conceptual library rendering that gives residents an idea of what a future library might look like should a ballot measure pass. That's available on the city website. We also posted a large board of the rendering at the Capitola branch library, so if folks are interested in that, it is available. Good news in regard to our housing element. We received certification from the state last month, and so that's final. It's done, and we're good for 8 years before we have to worry about another update. So that was
Congratulations.
probably the easiest housing element we'll ever see, too. So I got lucky on that one. A few upcoming hearing dates just to make you and the public aware of. Next week, Thursday, March 10th, City Council will consider an appeal of the wireless telecommunication facility that the Planning Commission approved. I believe it was at the February meeting. The following meeting, City Council meeting on March 24th, they will consider the in-lieu parking fee. That was an item that the Council requested to do a review of. Currently, in-lieu parking is restricted to large hotels in the village to provide valet service. There may be some interest in opening that up to allow other users in the village to take advantage of the in-lieu parking program. Finally, on April 14th, the City Council will consider an appeal of the Garnett design permit and variance that you approved also at last month's meeting. And so that's the planning items coming up on the City Council agenda.
Question, the final EIR with all of the comments and stuff, will we get a copy of that in advance of the meeting, or?
Yes. Yes. At least 10 days in advance we'll get a hard copy. I'm going to try to get it a little bit sooner to that, but absolutely. And I believe you all have copies of the original EIR.
Yes.
One thing for clarification, the final EIR is usually a much thinner document that's an addendum, sort of, for lack of a better word, to the original EIR. So with that, I'll segue into more CEQA talk. At the request of the Commission a couple of months ago, I was requested to give a little overview of the California Environmental Quality Act. Unfortunately, we had to postpone it due to other business being on the agenda, but we'll go through it here this evening. Just by way of background, the California Environmental Quality Act was enacted by the California Legislature in 1970. It's modeled after the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a federal environmental protection legislation. It requires all public agencies to consider environmental effects of discretionary projects, and California is one of 16 states that has a NEPA-like statute in place. The primary purposes of CEQA is, number one, public disclosure, to inform the public and decision makers of the potential environmental effects of discretionary projects, and to enhance public participation and interagency cooperation on discretionary projects. The other main purpose of CEQA is environmental protection, to require measures to avoid, minimize, or to mitigate significant environmental effects. It also requires agencies to consider less damaging project alternatives when you prepare an environmental impact report. One key distinction that's often misunderstood is CEQA does not approve or deny a project. It's an informational document only. So as I mentioned, CEQA applies to all discretionary projects. These are things like construction projects, general plan and ordinance amendments, but it does, it also includes activities involving public agency leases, permits, licensings, or funding. But it does not apply to ministerial actions, things like building permits, business licenses, and then your more minor planning permits that are issued administratively, like fences or certificates of compliance. The project, a discretionary project, is the whole of an action which has a potential to result in either a direct physical change in the environment or a reasonable foreseeable indirect physical change. And a key piece of that is that you cannot segment or piecemeal a project into smaller parts to avoid CEQA or to minimize the potential effects of a project. An example of that I've seen in the past is utilities where they'll have a multi-mile pipeline project and they slowly process a few thousand feet at a time to get exemptions when there's a big project, and those have been cases of litigation. To give you an idea of the responsible parties in CEQA, the lead agency, which the City of Capitola is in most cases when we're doing CEQA work, because we have the primary approval authority over a project. There's also responsible agencies. These are agencies that have approval authority over some aspect of the project. Example would be a coastal commission, also Department of Fish and Game. And then there's trustee agencies who have authority over some resources that are affected by the project. So the first level of CEQA review is the exemptions. These are projects where you have to review the project to determine what level of CEQA review you do on it. There are several different types of CEQA exemptions I'll go over briefly. The first is a statutory exemption. Another way to think of it is unconditional. It's written right into CEQA that these types of projects require no analysis. Examples are emergency projects, rate tolls, fees, and a common one is feasibility or planning studies. Categorical exemptions are more conditional. Common examples that we see almost at every meeting are minor alterations to existing facilities, new construction of small structures, or minor subdivisions in urbanized areas. They're conditional because if you have the presence of historic resources, contamination, or other unusual circumstances, that would take it out of a categorical exemption. Another exemption that we do use and a lot of agencies use is the general rule or the common sense rule. And this is used where a project does not neatly fit into other exemption categories, but where it can be seen with certainty that there's no possibility of an activity having a significant environmental effect. One other exemption that we've begun to use by virtue of having a recently adopted general plan is the general plan community plan exemption that's listed in CEQA. It's a little bit of a different process. The project has to conform with the adopted general plan, meet the density, and not have any peculiar circumstances. And I put the word peculiar as highlighted because that, to me, is always a very high standard, more than substantial. It also differs in that a lot of these projects may require technical studies. Typically, if we have a categorical exemption, there's no technical studies that we do for those. These types of projects might require more analysis, but they're still an exemption. We recently used this for the 38th Avenue residential subdivision that the Planning Commission considered. If a project doesn't qualify for an exemption, we go through the initial study. The purpose is to determine if a project may have a significant effect on the environment and what level of environmental document is appropriate. Appendix G of the CEQA guidelines requires the initial study content. It breaks down the environmental checklist by topic, such as biology, historic resources, traffic, and those types of issues. This slide shows kind of an example of the initial study. There's categories at the top of potentially significant, less than significant with mitigation, less than significant and no impact. Projects which either have no impact or less than significant findings across the board generally are either going to be exempt or be processed with a negative declaration. If you get into a situation where you need some form of mitigation, then you're into a mitigated negative declaration. And then if you have any areas, a single issue area where you identify a potentially significant impact that triggers the requirement to prepare an EIR. Technical studies are generally prepared for all these levels of environmental review. And it's important to note that sometimes you'll go through an initial study and you'll conclude there are no impacts, and you can always go back and do an exemption if you can substantiate it. A tip that I always try to convey to the public, decision makers, and staff is you got to read the questions very closely and respond accordingly. An example here would be aesthetics. I think just about any project that's above ground has some aesthetic impact, but CEQA qualifies those impacts to whether or not it's affecting a scenic vista, scenic resources, or something that substantially degrades existing visual character. Just because it's visible doesn't mean it's an impact. So then you get into significance determinations, and these can be somewhat subjective and tricky. A significant effect on the environment, a substantial or potentially substantial adverse change in the conditions of the area. CEQA calls for agency judgment that they recognize that oftentimes ironclad definitions are not possible, but it's the lead agency's obligation to base their findings on substantial evidence. Thresholds of significance, you do get some guidance in the CEQA guidelines. An example would be air quality, where they talk about exceeding adopted air quality district standards. But in many cases, there really isn't a lot of guidance. Some agencies that deal more with bigger projects and a lot more CEQA-intensive work adopt thresholds of significance to aid that process. Like Capitola, where we don't have adopted thresholds, we often have to identify threshold. We often look at what other agencies use, common practices, what fits Capitola to set that standard. So just getting in a little bit more on the various types of CEQA documents. A negative declaration, again, is kind of a rather brief statement by the lead agency which describes the reason that a project will not have a significant effect on the environment. Mitigated negative declaration is the same thing. It just identifies the mitigation measures that are triggered through the project. Both negative declarations and those with mitigation typically require a 30-day public review and comment period that could be reduced if there are no other responsible or trustee agencies which require submitting to the state clearinghouse, but that's pretty rare. And the lead agency generally provides written responses to all comments received in response to a negative declaration. It's technically not required in CEQA, but everywhere I've ever worked, it's good practice. I think you want to, give that response to the public when they take the time to offer their commentary. At the end of the process, the agency files a notice of determination. The key with that is it reduces the statute of limitations to file a lawsuit to challenge a CEQA document from 6 months to 30 days. So it's an important step. And then finally, negative declarations do require, as of 2015, I think this has now gone up, a $2,210 fee payable to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Environmental impact reports, these are the thick ones that go in much more detail about projects, and that's required anytime a project may result in a potentially significant environmental effect. And I highlight the words may and potentially because the standard is not that high to trip you from a negative declaration to an EIR, and I'll describe that a little more. There are some unique steps in the EIR process, not that you don't have to go through with negative declarations. The initial study is still the same, but you do a notice of preparation to notify the state clearinghouse, any other responsible trustee agencies, and interested members of the public that you are preparing an EIR, and to solicit their comments and feedback to help you scope the content of the EIR. A public scoping meeting is required if you have a project which is of regional or area-wide significance. They're not always required, but again, I think it's usually good practice to invite the public and allow them an opportunity to speak about what they think the potential effects of a project might be. Public review period is extended. Typically, it's 45 days. Again, if there's no clearinghouse review, it can be reduced to 30, and then CEQA does suggest a maximum public review period of 60 days. There's still the written response to comments in the public hearing, and then an increased Department of Fish and Game fee that exceeds $3,000. There are also some specific content in EIRs. You must present a reasonable range of project alternatives. The alternatives must be feasible and reduce one or more of the identified impacts in the EIR. There's a mandatory no project alternative, which basically looks at the baseline condition with no change. Generally, you have a reduced project alternative where you just reduce the size or the intensity of the proposal, and you are required to evaluate alternative sites if there are other locations that could accommodate the project that are within the control of the applicant or the lead agency to site that project. And then finally, you have to identify an environmentally superior alternative. EIRs have to have an analysis of growth-inducing impacts, not common for Capitola, generally projects where you extend roads, water, sewer, other infrastructure into undeveloped areas. EIRs also have special findings. If there is a significant unmitigated impact identified in the EIR, the Planning Commission or City Council would need to adopt a statement of overriding considerations, which finds that there are specific economic, legal, social benefits which, in the agency's judgment, outweigh those potential environmental effects. Briefly, a couple of other CEQA documents we do occasionally prepare here are addenda. If we have a previously certified or EIR, we can write a brief addendum to them, generally when there's minor technical changes. If you don't qualify for an addenda, you can do a subsequent or supplemental negative declaration or EIR. This is when there are new or more severe environmental effects or new information of substantial importance. And then finally, there's a program EIR. We did one for our general plan. Sometimes if you have a large project, like I can imagine if the mall ever redeveloped, there might be something more of a programmatic level prepared. So in relation to negative declarations versus EIRs, the standard that really sets them apart is negative declarations are subject to a fair argument standard, which is a very low standard of review, and EIRs have a higher substantial evidence standard. Fair arguments generally favor preparation of an EIR. If the lead agency hires experts to prepare technical studies and somebody else who's an expert disagrees, that in itself would trigger the need to prepare an EIR. And the result of that is negative declarations tend to have a much higher litigation risk for lead agencies. The substantial evidence test, these include facts, expert opinion, based on facts, but do not include argument, speculation, or unsubstantiated opinion. And with EIRs, courts typically will be a little more deferential to the lead agency's decision, and EIRs therefore have a lower risk of litigation. Pardon me. So just charting out, EIRs of course take a lot more time, but it does reduce the litigation risk. Neg decs, much more expeditious, but they are much more prone to legal challenges. In terms of mitigation, mitigation measures must be feasible and enforceable, and they must also be made conditions of project approval. Generally, they need to occur prior to or concurrent with the impact. There are times when there's limited exceptions if a mitigation measure is a realistic performance standard. A common example is a contribution towards a future traffic improvement that's identified. And another thing to keep in mind with mitigation is nexus and proportionality. You may have heard Nolan and Dolan, the Supreme Court cases. Any mitigation measure that we as a city would impose on a project must be directly linked to the impact. We can require somebody to contribute to a traffic signal for a traffic effect, but we couldn't require them to make a contribution to a library improvement to offset it. And they also have to be roughly proportionate to the project's impacts, which I think is pretty explanatory. The responses to comments, we're obligated to respond in writing to all comments received during a public review period for EIRs, neg decs. It's good practice. We may respond to late comments, but we're not obligated to do so. However, we are required, and the Planning Commission as decision makers must consider all late comments that are submitted. And you may have had the delay tactic document dumps occur to you in the past, where someone shows up at a hearing with a stack of paperwork, they drop it off, you have to delay the hearing to give yourself time to consider it, and you might have that repeated many times, just to delay a decision on the project. There has been legislative attempts to fix that in CEQA for over a decade, and for some reason it never gets passed, but it seems to frustrate everybody. The response content, the agency must provide a detailed explanation. We make a good faith, well-reasoned response and not just unsupported conclusory statements. But detailed responses are not required if a comment does not address a valid CEQA concern. So the Planning Commission's role is to always consider the information in the CEQA document that's placed before you on a project, to consider those public comments in response to the CEQA document, and then to make the necessary findings, that you consider the CEQA document, that it reflects your independent judgment, that environmental effects have been mitigated to the extent feasible, as appropriate to adopt a mitigation monitoring and reporting program, and then again, if there are significant unmitigated effects, to adopt a statement of overriding considerations. Just a little nuance, negative decks and mitigated neg decks you adopt when you certify an EIR. Just a few common pitfalls and misunderstandings with CEQA, or what I jokingly like to refer to as CEQA-cide. Deferred analysis. Occasionally I'll see somebody who will try to defer study of an environmental issue through a project condition of approval. You can't do that. You have to do it up front. There are, again, some limited exceptions. A common one I'm familiar with is interior noise levels, where there's common engineering and building practices to mitigate those. You can defer a study of interior noise levels because you can put in double pane windows, thicker walls, things like that to address it. Uncertain or deferred mitigation is another CEQA no-no. They have to be real, enforceable, and appropriately timed. Another thing that I think most public agency staff often struggle with is managing risk. When to know when preparing a negative declaration is going to be adequate, or when you should just cut to the chase, prepare an EIR, and put the city in a very legally defensible position. And then finally, conclusory or unsupported findings are always easy targets if someone wants to challenge a CEQA document. Some limitations. Social and economic issues are not CEQA issues, so things like property values, taxes, maintenance costs. We often see those in our comments to CEQA documents, but it's not covered by CEQA, so we oftentimes do not give much of a response to those. Land use, zoning, general plan consistency are not CEQA issues. Community character. The exceptions might be if there was a policy in your general plan which was adopted specifically to avoid environmental effect. Project was inconsistent with that, it would be a CEQA issue. Size, scale, mass, and design, not CEQA issues, but other operating characteristics like noise, odor, traffic would be. Parking is an interesting issue because it's gone back and forth in CEQA. I think originally it was not a CEQA issue. For a time it was. Today it is not. The only case where you might consider parking is if a parking shortage resulted in a need to build off-site parking that might have an environmental effect or create some kind of traffic hazard. Public service impacts is a common misconception. CEQA does evaluate impacts to police, fire, schools, and parks, but only to the extent that it requires an agency to build or expand facilities, which in turn might have an environmental effect. So if a residential project brings more students to a school, the effect on the school itself is not a CEQA issue. Biology, briefly, CEQA covers sensitive habitats and wildlife. It does not cover any kind of forms of urban wildlife, common things like rabbits, raccoons, birds, and it's habitat-based. Removing an individual tree or plant is generally okay unless it's an endangered or threatened species. And then finally, adopted certified CEQA documents do not expire to the extent that the information remains relevant and pertinent. It can be 10 years old and you can still rely on it. But if it does get outdated, it doesn't reflect current conditions in the field, then it would have to be updated. And so you can continue to tear off of those documents. And that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
I have a question. It's a very good presentation. All of those things that are not CEQA concerns should and can still be considered on a project. It's just not in part of the EIR. Okay.
Yeah, they're oftentimes very appropriate to talk about in the context of zoning, land use, policy, things of that nature. They're just not covered by CEQA.
So I get a little concerned sometimes. For example, if you know that you have intersections in your town that are have an significant impact already, and you're looking at doing a project around it. I've seen a lot of cities say, well, you have to do an EIR because that's the only mechanism that you have to make a finding of overriding consideration to deal with that issue. You know, my recollection is we might have a few intersections around town that, you know, are sort of at that point. So it seems like it's really a judgment call and a difficult one for the planning department.
Yes.
Because if you have a project that has any controversy to it, those people are going to have to do an EIR, or else someone can claim that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's been a frustration of mine for a long time before I came here, and Capitola certainly experiences it. We do have failing intersections, and we do a cumulative analysis, often adding any trips to a failing intersection or segment of roadway technically is a significant environmental effect that requires mitigation. If you can't mitigate it, you're doing overrides. There are ways to address it. I mean, we could look at adopting thresholds of significance. We could look at adopting a transportation impact fee to address some of those, but there's other problems for a city the size of Capitola with those programs. The one good piece of good news I would offer is CEQA's being reformed to change from a level of service standard into more of a see if I can articulate this well, more of a standard of keeping the issue is, I think they want to keep encouraging infill development where it's more walkable, less transit dependent, and so they're getting away from the level of service standards, so we may not have that problem in a year or two if those CEQA reforms go in place. So I'm cautiously hopeful about that.
I think you did a great job. Thank you. I
Apologies if
appreciate-
it was a little too
I
long.
We even saw some humor from the planning humor, so that was
Yeah.
good.
There is planning humor.
I heard it tonight. Ben left, so I thought you really bored him, but he's back. So
He's back.
well, thank you for that. That was a lengthy director's report, probably the longest I've heard. So any more questions for staff about that?
I think we cleared the room on that one.
Commission communications? I just have one. The Traffic and Parking Commission had like a little subcommittee that was reviewing employer parking. And really, it's interesting that the findings were nothing you didn't already know probably. But so it has to do with trying to look at the issue of where the employees park in the businesses in the village. And, you know, if we can find a way to encourage them to facilitate or use our parking lot or parking program. So that was a good study, and we're going to review that at our next traffic and parking meeting next Wednesday. And if that's it, then I guess we will adjourn our regular scheduled meeting and continue our special meeting. Is that all right? Great. So we want to move back into, we just started item 1, I believe. And
Didn't we pretty much
We're
finish?
going to move on item 1. We're going to save that for, I'm sorry.
I thought we pretty much finished topic 1, and we're deferring topic 2 to March 17th when
Right.
Ed's back, right?
Also topic 3, because that's the sort of.
Oh, defer that one too? Yeah.
Do you need a minute, Linda?
I'm figuring out how to make a new section
Okay.
for the information, but go ahead.
So I have a question to ask you while she's waiting, maybe sort of a process question. So I gave you some of my comments on and I've actually read a few more chapters since I talked to you. So seems like I need to get those comments to you so they can be on your March 17th summary. Can you sort of tell me when you need those by? I mean, I can email something to you.
So next Friday is the docket date for the 17th hearing, so if we get them Thursday or before, that'd be great.
Well, or probably Tuesday or Wednesday would work better for.
Perfect.
Be great.
Okay, so I will try and get you the rest of my comments in before Tuesday or Wednesday.
So we won't see the,
I can send you each your draft so that you can ensure that what I've written down reflects your comments correctly, and then I can do that on Monday, and then you can send them back to me by Wednesday. That would be like Wednesday at 5, so I have Thursday to put them together. Be great.
So the first time we're going to see the consolidated list is the Friday before the March 17th meeting? But at that point, we'll see everybody's.
Everybody's, yep, just to ensure that I got your comments correct. I'll try to get them to you tomorrow, actually, if I have time to get through them all.
So can we, I guess it's Mr. Chair, can we, at the end, before we adjourn tonight's meeting, revisit our discussion about process and going forward? Because now that I've had some more time to think about it, I just want to understand where we're going, make sure we're all on the same page with what the next meeting will look like.
I think
Do
that's fine.
we want to do that now before we go any further?
I would prefer to go through a couple of issues so that I can see how we walk through them, because then, and then have the discussion. If that's acceptable, I'd like to do it after, just save us time to do it.
Maybe what changed your thinking here?
When we get into discussions, if we start at the beginning of the book and we go page by page by
Right.
page, I'm afraid we'll get bogged down in detail that doesn't really need to bog us down. So this is a great discussion to talk about the 6-seat rule and see how it winds up getting discussed and if we get bogged down or not. It would just help me understand how we're going to work.
Okay. That's
Not
fine.
in theory, but in reality.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and we'll start with topic 4 here, and that's the 6-seat rule for takeout establishments.
Well, I'm absolutely in favor of getting rid of counting seats. It's always been a problem for the city. I think the question really is, what is the appropriate size for a takeout place? And for me, I think that I would be more inclined to go somewhere like, 250 feet. I don't know if I would be, was trying to figure out, how big of a space 250 feet is. That could be like 10 by 25. So that seems,
Yeah, you can kind of put Armida's in perspective there. It's pretty
Right.
close, so.
So if Armida turned into a takeout restaurant instead of a wine tasting room, if you will, 250 feet would allow it to not be an intensification of use. But Petit Fours, which is 450 and only has 6 seats today,
It's being built right
It's
now,
it's not done yet, it's not open.
under construction.
But right next door is Village Deli, right? That's to Armida Winery. And so, yeah, it's really close when I wouldn't have guessed it was, it's 40 feet smaller. I don't know that it would make much of a difference to me. If
you want to go
maybe
300 feet?
300 would make it.
I could live with 300 feet.
is Petit Fours being built as a to-go restaurant today?
It is, they came in maybe 6 months ago, I'm not quite sure, maybe it was
It used
last
to be
summer.
the cookie store.
It was the cookie store, yeah.
Oh, got it. Now I'm with you. So what we're saying now is that if it came under the new code, it would not be allowed, it would be an intensification of use, or it wouldn't be allowed to be a to-go restaurant? Is that what we're saying?
That would have had to come in as a restaurant and would have been required to have more parking.
And this is just in the village. This is not in other areas, correct?
That's right.
Just in the village?
That's where I'm kind of getting a little confused in the code is, exactly, because they're all mixed together, I can't tell which one we're talking about, and there might be a little bit of a typo in the staff report. I'm just a little confused here, having to do with the parking and the takeout. But I know we're not going to talk about 3, so I'll talk about that later. Sorry. But I have no problem with the 300. I think that's a little more reasonable. The 400 was a pretty big jump.
Yeah.
300?
300 works for me.
Okay, we'll move on to the next item.
So on-site parking alternatives.
Oops, excuse me.
So I've put the page numbers also for reference on the bottom right corner of each slide to help you get to the correct page. So this is page 76-9. And
So this is kind of was my discussion about whether we go straight to it or jump around, because it really ties to other items to me. So when we look at the on-site parking alternatives, at the item I on 76.
Page number?
76,
76-9.
well, it starts at 76.9.
yeah, and valet starts on
Talks about
7610.
in-lieu parking.
But we're only talking about 1776.050. We're not talking about any of the rest of the parking section. We're just that one, that,
Well, we're talking about on-site parking, right? Mm-hmm. And under on-site parking, item I is fees in lieu of parking?
So item E is valet parking.
Oh, we're only
So
talking about
we'll-
item E on valet parking, is that right?
Yeah, we'll go through each of them because I have a slide on each of them.
Okay.
We're
And-
talking about, are we talking about everything that begins on 76.9, 76.10, 11, and part of 12?
Correct.
right.
Okay?
Yes.
Can we review them in the order that they're in the book?
Sure. I'm good with that.
So,
Well,
So I didn't have a slide on the off-site parking because I was going through the on-site parking alternatives, but there is a standard for off-site parking, and this is for multifamily housing and non-residential uses. Are you all on the same page and see where I'm at under C?
You see,
10,
yeah.
yes.
Okay. I can go over those standards with you quick, and then we can discuss.
Okay.
Sound good? So off-site parking for multifamily housing and non-residential uses, the Planning Commission may allow for off-site parking if the commission finds that practical difficulties prevent parking from being located on the same lot. To do so, the off-site parking has to be within a reasonable distance of the use intended to serve. A deed restriction or other legal instrument must be approved by the city attorney and shall be filed with the county recorder, the covenant, and then there's a recording requirement so that that remains tied to the use that's sharing the off-site parking. The terms deed restriction, that was, Commissioner Newman requested that change during the review. He thought that would be better than a covenant record. So that's the discussion on off-site parking. That actually is closely, that's something that came from the existing code. Right now, we do have an allowance for off-site parking as long as there's an agreement in place and that it's close to the parking that is on-site. So,
and so that applies to multifamily housing and commercial developments wherever they might be in the city.
yes.
so how do we define reasonable distance?
That's a great question.
Yeah, it's subjective. We could put a number value to it or some maximums or some kind of limits. That's the way it's worded today, is that it be a reasonable distance.
Because it seems to me somewhere else in here, when we talk about shared parking, don't we have a 400-foot
From the entrance.
limit on that? So to me, there ought to be some parameters so we have something to go by. I mean, if you come to a planning commission and say, what is a reasonable difference, we don't have anything to base it on. And, I'm open to hearing from staff or whatever about if you have some suggestions there, but it does seem to me that,
Yeah, I think we have to talk about, what off-site parking will look like. What are the different types of off-site parking we'll have? And the most common one we're going to have is the parking lot, right? I mean, is that the kind of off-site parking that you're talking about where, in the village, we would have people parking here and walking into the village?
Isn't the trestle parking also, wouldn't that be considered off-site parking?
I think the trestle parking is a good example. I would make a distinction with the city, beach, and village parking lots, because those are kind of covered by an in lieu policy. Another example might be on 41st Avenue or Capitola Road, where a business could go in, maybe Union Bank up on Bay and Capitola Avenue. Maybe Gales would want to do some shared parking arrangement with them. That could be a hypothetical situation where it might work.
So we're talking about employees walking from their car to where they're going to work, right?
Employees or patrons?
Yeah, so I think we have to be reasonable about the distance that Californians and people really want to walk, I mean, I think we want to change those standards and we want people to walk more. I think we still have to be reasonable about that. And I think 400 feet might be a little bit short. I mean, what are we talking about feet-wise? Let's just say from the parking lot to the village. What's
Several hundred, maybe over 1,000, I think.
right?
We do a quarter mile.
Yeah.
So if we start talking about really looking at, all right, where would my employees be willing to park off-site and then walk to work? Often employees are walking in the dark and it's not safe and all that, so.
But this is also for multifamily housing.
Yeah.
So people are
Yeah,
going to
sure.
park and then, be carrying their groceries and going to their place where they live. So maybe we want a standard for multifamily housing. I mean, I could see multifamily housing needing a standard that's much closer
Right.
than, if you're going to ask. I mean, I could see a quarter of a mile if it's going to be employees walking to work. A quarter of a mile seems too far for me for multifamily housing.
So,
How many feet
This
is
is-
a quarter of a mile?
1360, I think,
So that's about.
1340, 1320.
so when I'm looking at this, the shared parking is kind of what we're talking about, Union
talking
Bank and
about-
Gales sharing parking, right? That's not
No, we're not
off-site
like-
parking, or is it both?
I think right now.
That would be
we're
off-site
saying
parking.
It would be off-site parking.
Be off-site parking.
Off-site.
When I think of off-site parking, I think that, I don't know, Macy's buys a lot somewhere else for their employees to park in because they feel like they don't have enough parking for their there's not enough parking for their customers. That's.
An example.
So is there a typo on item 2, C2?
Yes.
And it should be off-site? instead of-
Off-site.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
One tension that I would point out a lot of times with setting standards is, you do start getting into, are we going to set a unique, distinct standard for all the universe of potential projects that come in? And what are those standards? And that can oftentimes be desirable, as opposed to having something reasonable that's subjective. And every time an application comes in, we have to kind of grapple with, does that seem like it's going to work? So just something to keep in mind. I think we can always add standards, but, it sometimes can make things a little trickier. Then you get someone that's 10 feet over. Is that
And
okay?
I think you can have something, you can have wording in there that says, it's approximately within a quarter of a mile.
Sure.
So if they're, slightly over, that's fine, they're approximately within a quarter of a mile. You can deal with those, but if we just go that everything's going to just depend on who happens to be sitting up here, I get to be a little uncomfortable with that. And I don't want to make them unreasonable, but I do think it should be different for multifamily than it is for non-residential, and multifamily ought to be significantly closer. I could do 1/8 of a mile for multifamily and do a quarter of a mile for commercial. That's just to
But
get
it's
a
some
discussion going.
approximate qualifier to give a little
Approximate,
wiggle room. Okay?
Any objection to that direction? Anyone want to further discuss that one of an eighth of a
don't have
mile
any
and a quarter of a mile
I'm good with it.
approximately?
Sounds good.
Good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so then we'll go to D, shared parking, and this is different. Shared parking is for when we do our shared parking studies. So for a mixed land use development on a single parcel, this would not apply to residential land uses, as that came out of our issues and options discussions. Also, parking demand study would be required with findings of no substantial conflicts. And the shared parking would have to be within 400 feet of the primary residence entrance, sorry.
So I have an issue that I would like us to figure out a way to address, because it sort of clouds a lot of things for me. And that is that we all sort of dealt with the parking study that came in for the last mercantile application, which in my opinion was not a good parking study, parking demand study. It really didn't make a whole lot of logical sense. And when you're at a place where you're reducing the parking by more than 50% by coming up with scenarios that don't really seem to work for me. So I think in these, like in the shared parking, there needs to be, some limit of how much can be shared.
Well, my concern was, I think falls in line with that, is who does the parking study? How do we allow that parking study to be done? I mean, I see it says a parking demand study approved by the community development director. So if I'm thinking of a business who wants to look at shared park, where do they go to for direction on how they do that, I guess is what I'm asking. And so do they just come up with their own, like the mercantile who did their own study, or is it someone that's a list of vendors that we recommend? Or
The typical standard process would be an applicant come in, we would hire an independent traffic engineer to do that work. The mercantile case is a little different. They came to us,
That's a conceptual.
met with us for, 18 months on and off, and said that they wanted to do a project and they could show that they didn't need all this parking. And they presented this parking study, said, we want to go bring it to the decision makers. And we said, well, you're free to do that. We'll have someone else take a look at it. It's your study. We're not really endorsing it. I shared a lot of the same concerns. And when we spoke with Commissioner Westman, I sort of felt that that was a good suggestion to cap it, particularly in the village. Maybe 41st Avenue, we're not quite as sensitive. Maybe it's a higher cap.
Right, I'm not concerned about 41st Avenue, but it seems like, down in the village, you need to have some sort of
And possibly parts of Bay Avenue.
parts of Bay Avenue, yeah.
And I like the fact that you used a percentage in valet of 25, and I think using that percentage is a good way to go.
I could go with 25.
And would we want that maybe to apply to the village and community commercial, mixed-use areas, not regional commercial?
I would only want it for the village and the neighborhood commercial. I'm still calling it neighborhood commercial, mixed-use neighborhood
Understood.
district. I'm not concerned about the CC district or the CR district.
So up on Bay near Nob Hill, with community commercial, that's not a particular
Right.
concern. Okay.
But in,
Well, it is, I have to tell you, it is to the neighbors. The parking situation to the neighbors, and, I'm one of the biggest problems, so I have to fess up here, it's a gnarly parking situation up there, and I think we need to consider future parking issues up there.
And an example of it would be that the parking lot that Gales shares with the other businesses that are there, that the parking, because we've got a new business coming into one of those buildings,
I
right?
don't think shared parking means that. I don't know. I don't think you'd ever consider only existing commercial being, quote, shared parking. Or you're saying that if
but it is considered, like, on Orchard tonight, we looked at that application, all of the people in Kings Plaza share the parking. And we said tonight that we thought that new business coming in was not going to have an impact on that shared parking in that parking lot.
Right. But you've got a new business coming in where Many Hands is moving out.
Yeah.
And when we look at, we actually don't look at it unless it intensifies the use, do we?
That's
not-
right. If they
that's
came
not
in-
the same,
So it's not the same thing at all?
That's not the same property owner. It's not the same property, even though it looks like it is. But let's say Pacific Trading
Yeah.
goes
Yeah.
out, and an office that's going to only do, have 2 people in it and never see anybody.
But where you are, it's in the MUN zoning
That's right.
district. It's not in the CC zoning district.
Right.
So,
So you're saying neighborhood is
so I'm saying, I think
Include
there
that.
ought to be a limit in the village and the neighborhood,
Good.
but not in the
Good.
area
I
around
forgot that.
Bay
We are a
Avenue
new
where Knob
designation.
Hill
Yeah.
is, or the CR or the CC.
And I think that for our area, 25% is the right figure as well.
So 25% in what areas?
In the,
MU, and MUN.
Mixed-use
I'm
neighborhoods.
never going to get this in.
But in
The mon.
in
We'll get it.
It's die hard.
Hard to teach an old dog new tricks.
other commercial areas, this fits with no maximum limit. What you're saying, right?
Right, I'm
That's
saying
based on
that the
parking study.
shared parking up there can have a little more flexibility to it. We can look more at, parking demand studies.
In the case of the Mercantile, where they brought their own parking study, and under this, you would have to approve that parking study.
I would, yeah, well, I don't know if I'd have to approve it. I could also bring it forward and say, I don't buy it.
We demand our own.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we would have the right to demand our own.
Yeah, and I think if that was a formal application, we would have given a much more rigorous review, and I would have had stronger recommendations on it. But it was sort of their proposal, and they want to see if the commission and council would agree to something like that, so.
And I, we'll get to it a little later. I think when it comes to, parking demand studies, particularly in the village, that it's okay for the city to adopt some criteria down there because, the village is unique compared, 41st Avenue might work for the numbers that come out of the regular traffic information books because it's the standard commercial area. But, Capitola Village has the beach. We want to keep the residential. We have a whole residential parking program down there using some of the spaces. It seems like we ought to make certain whatever study's done for the village is going to include the unique characteristics that are down there and the goals that we have for that area.
But in talking about shared parking, we have a couple of examples of sharing parking between commercial and residential that don't work.
Right.
So we want to make sure that we don't proliferate that and that our zoning code prevents it from happening in that way again. And the Mercantile proposal that we were looking at was a good example of residential and
Right, and we say that there
Mixing.
can't be shared parking
Right, okay.
from residential and commercial.
Right.
So next we're on to valet parking.
Let me go back. Is there a definition for shared parking in the glossary? There is not. I'm
Okay.
wondering if there should be one.
We can add that.
I'd like to see that when it gets added, if it can.
And we might want one for off-site parking, just so we, right.
I was surprised that the list of definition in the old code is much more extensive than the glossary in this one. And I wondered if, because the first paragraph sort of defines what shared parking is, but just in our discussion, you can see how much confusion
Yeah.
can be there.
Yeah, I would acknowledge that we have some work to do on the glossary still. But I think if you look through the glossary of today's code, there's a lot of antiquated terms and redundancy that we did try to eliminate, so. But yeah, I agree.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to pick that one up and put it in here. Definitely not.
Well, maybe we can, keep that in mind and always, bring it up if we
Yes.
see something that might not be, so, yeah, okay.
So are we on
Okay,
valet
so-
We're on
Okay.
to valet parking. So within valet parking, there's a maximum of 25% reduction. It should be staffed by an attendant. In the code, it says at all times. That's one modification that's been brought up to state when open. And
What's that, sorry?
instead of at all times to have it staffed by an attendant, it's when it's when the
When
business is
open,
open.
right.
It should have a designated drop-off and pickup area. It requires planning commission approval. It also requires a study that's reviewed by the community development director and the public works director. And there should be no interference with vehicles or pedestrians.
I like that. Do we want to say anything about a general valet parking area for the village, not just a particular business? Or just include that in valet parking and have it say, this holds true for the village in general, a valet parking system, because somebody someday is going to come in with a valet parking proposal for the village. And so we want to make sure that they understand that this, if we want it to be, this refers to individual businesses as well as a business that would open for all of the businesses in the village, or all the village, the beach, everything.
Also,
Does
like
that
the
make
distinction
sense?
between a private valet business exclusive use versus a valet business that might serve just the general public.
Several uses
Okay.
in the village.
Sure.
Because my guess is we're going to come up with that someday. I mean, I just saw it in La Jolla, and it's, it worked great.
And we have the cycling valet. The cycling valet?
Pedicabs.
Yeah, pedicabs.
We had them, and it was great, but they left.
They pop up from time to time
Yeah,
still.
they were
and
back.
He thinks he can make some money.
Right.
Okay, was that valet?
Okay. Next is low demand, so an exception for a land use that typically does not, there can be findings that it's a low demand land use. It doesn't require the parking that's required in the code.
So this is for anywhere in Capitola.
Anywhere, yes. And there is no maximum tied to it. It requires a study that's reviewed by the community development director and public works director, and then essentially approved by the planning commission.
But this is only for employers who have 25 or more
Oh,
employees.
sorry. No,
No,
this is for the low demand. So
Oh,
this
low
would be,
demand. Sorry.
I'd say an example would be if you had an establishment that's like a retail space that became a new one-on-one trainer for personal trainer, and they take in one client at a time, and so the demand from retail to being a personal trainer establishment, it wouldn't carry as high, so then they would do a study to say they're actually decreasing demand, they don't need all this parking they have, maybe they want to do a shared parking with someone else, with their excess, but that we can make findings that this personal trainer that only takes one client at a time, is that a good example?
And then if it went back to being a retail use again, they would have to provide
On-site parking?
the parking that they gave up.
So in other words, that trainer is going into a spot that there isn't adequate parking now for that site, but we can,
Yeah, or there is adequate parking, or it's a new building maybe that doesn't have any parking, but I don't think it really matters how much is on site. They would only probably do the study if there was not adequate parking on site, to show that although there's not adequate parking, it does meet their need.
for that many square feet.
Yeah.
But if under the shared, your example of they want to share their parking, then if somebody else came in and said, well, I'm going to use this shared parking with these guys to meet my parking requirement, then we'd require a study saying that they didn't need their parking.
Yeah, I have some friends looking for an office space in the village area. Would be him and his wife. They don't have clients that come in because all their work's off-site, so, I could see how this would affect them.
Okay.
Okay?
Sure.
Okay, next is the Transportation Demand Management Plan, and this is a reduction that goes up to 15%. It's only available to employers with 25 or more employees. I think the big thing to take away on this is that the plan identifies acceptable measures, such as an employee shuttle. It will not include measures that encourage. So if it's a business that's encouraging their employees to bike to work, and they have a program that maybe they get a long lunch break because they can bike to work or something, that would be an encouraging, and it's not an acceptable measure because it's not a program that's carried out. So the employer in this situation would have to track their TDMP and report it back to the Planning Commission. If the plan was not working, the Planning Commission has the ability to say, we've been tracked from your reports, we're seeing that you're not meeting, you're not decreasing your demand, and therefore we're going to require the on-site parking. So there is the
Right, but
ability to take
it
that.
seems to me that's almost an impossibility. I mean, if you have a business that you've let come in and open, and then you say, well, your parking program's not working, we've now decided that you have to add parking to your site. I mean, that's not going to happen. Right.
Yeah, I think probably the more realistic end result of that would either be revoking their permit or requiring them to enhance their parking management program. Like if it was relying on bikes and scooters, they say, no, you got to provide a shuttle if you want to keep operating. But
It seems like
I agree.
We don't want to get ourselves into, we don't want to get somebody into that situation. We want to write an ordinance that doesn't get somebody into, we don't want to ever get into a situation where we have to revoke someone's business license.
Right.
Well, you're going to get in that situation if,
So tell me why the transportation demand management was put into the ordinance? We should consider just taking it out for Capitola, or?
So I've seen it utilized in hotels well before, when they do have a shuttling employees to a hotel. That's one example that I have seen it work, and also combined with like a valet system, that would be another acceptable measure within a TDM. But I
but
think
we have a whole hotel system already sort of set up in the ordinance.
yeah, the only example that I can recall from my time here was when Monarch Cove was proposing their project. They were looking to get some kind of parking reduction by virtue of providing bicycles to their guests so that they could ride their bikes into the village rather than driving. Whether or not that would work, I don't know. But I don't know that it's terribly an important thing for Capitola. It's something we can consider, but
I would, if we were going to try and put something like this in, I would say that your real strict, detailed review needs to be at the beginning, reviewing the plan as part of the project, and that it should come to the Planning Commission instead of.
Could we start with it just in, again, the regional commercial and the CC? Because there aren't too many places in the MUV district or the MUN zoning district where someone's going to have more than 25 employees. I mean, there are a couple of exceptions, but there aren't really.
And, there's just not going to, I just don't see this happening in the village, with the exception of a hotel down in the village. I don't see it happening. So,
But Paradise surely has more than 25 employees.
but they are
and
so staggered that trying to provide a shuttle for staff like that is just, it's infeasible.
I agree. I totally agree with you. that the TDM, they couldn't put together a TDM plan that would be
But
adequate.
we're talking about something new coming in, because Paradise is there.
Yeah.
I mean, this program really would only apply to someone coming in and, opening up a new something that's not already there. And, you could take it out completely. We could leave it in the areas where there are larger properties and something might happen there. So you could do it in the regional commercial, because it might be feasible for some office building or some use up there. Might work in the CC commercial where you have some bigger things going on. We deal with a hotel in the MUV district, and that parking gets to, we deal with hotels that are over 20 units in another section of the zoning ordinance. So it seems like those uses we've sort of dealt with.
Yeah, I don't know. What does it hurt to leave it in there right now? And I guess so. I know we're because we start thinking about the village, but in the mixed-use neighborhood area that goes up Capitola Road towards DMV, the side of that, what if a business came in that, they wanted to use a shuttle or some other transportation model that, does it tie our hands if we leave it in there now? Are we?
Well, I think
It just
the
allows
difficulty for
flexibility.
me is that you could create a situation where you could ultimately say you need to shut down the business because they're not meeting, this program. Do we really want to, like
we don't
Gail
want that,
said?
but I like just to have options. I don't know. I just see. I like the opportunity for options to see.
I think if you're going to have one, though, it needs to come to the planning commission with the proposal and get approved all at one time.
Yeah, it says it
and
would
that's
come to
where-
the, yeah.
No, it
It
says
does
we
say
can
may
revoke it, but it says
does
it
say
gets,
it may revoke it, so you're giving them warning that you might revoke it.
you might revoke it, but
You
what,
can allow it.
yeah, I think that we should allow it.
It says that. It says the planning commission may reduce the number of required on-site spaces.
But
by
it says the
adopting-
TDM plan shall be approved by the community development director in consultation with the public works director. Doesn't say anything about a public hearing or presenting it to the planning
I think we
commission
should
with
have
the
a vote,
development.
yeah.
No, I think the intention there is that it would be the planning commission approving the project in conjunction with that plan, but the public works and community development director look and say, yeah, this kind of meets the program standards. We recommend that it meets the ordinance. But you would have the final say. And we can clarify that.
Now, this is really far-fetching, but so in this little study we did in the village about employer parking, a number of people commented they wished that they had the transportation available for their employees, the shuttle again. So let's just say that BIA decides that they want to start this parking program where they do that. Maybe it's somehow we can encourage that to get employees into the village so they're not parking in the neighborhoods and stuff. I just hate to see us tie our hands if it's something that's in there that may allow opportunity and flexibility that reduces the transportation in the village. I think it's an opportunity, but
I'd be all right with it if number 7 under G said something like, not only it may revoke the TDM plan at any time and require additional parking, but if there is a chance that, I think we need to be more specific, and if there's a chance that we might revoke their conditional use permit or whatever, it should be said in here.
Sure.
So that it spells it out, and also it should be under their conditions of approval.
Right.
And, so that all the way along, they realize that unless they do what they say they're going to do, this could be the consequence. I also have to say that, we need to take a look at our city and realize that there's not a lot of spaces to operate. I mean, where do we have parking lots from which to operate a shuttle? We don't have a lot of them. We've looked in our business and,
41st Avenue area, basically, right?
what if a business and I like to just keep going on because we come up with all these what ifs, but what if it was in, the parking was actually in SoCal or outside of our district and then bring the people in? So, because that is the issue, is parking in our own area, but quite frankly, I don't have a real beef with this thing either way.
I think our idea was it's another parking tool to talk about. It wasn't something that we felt strongly about. I share some of the concerns with the village. There might be applicability. Ben might have more experience with it, and if he does, I'll ask him to talk about it, because I haven't dealt with them a whole lot, to be candid. But it was just another tool that maybe would help a parking situation. That's why we thought, let's talk about it. But
Couple of comments on this. This is a possible parking reduction that applies to larger employers, so a business with 25 or more employees. It's common to see in communities that have a lot of large employers, particularly in Santa Clara County, primarily as a traffic management tool to just increase capacity of the roadways. In Capitola, you're a smaller community, unique, different type of situation, and we included it, as Rich said, as just another tool that can provide additional flexibility to deal with unique circumstances if they come up. If there is a relatively large employer who wants to locate on 41st Avenue, there's something about the business that enables them to not need to provide as much parking. It just increases the flexibility for the Planning Commission to see if there can be a sort of flexible solution.
I don't have a problem with this if we say that, we'd let people know that there are going to be consequences other than just finding more parking, because people aren't going to be able to find more parking.
I could go along with that. I'm happy.
Okay. Transit center credit. I did not have that in my slide, but the Planning Commission may reduce the number of required parking spaces by up to 10% for non-residential or multifamily development projects within 400 feet of a regional transit center.
Is our transit center considered a regional transit center?
At the mall, yes.
that's the mall.
So, because that kind of goes along with our general plan, that we have higher density areas along that corridor that I see that as a benefit.
Yeah, I have real concern about that transit center. I mean, they're greatly reducing the number of buses that go to it now. At some point in time, when is it not going to be a regional transit center? Because I think they operate like 30% of the buses that they used to operate there 10 years ago. So at what point in time is it not a transit center anymore and just a bus stop?
Well, in multifamily development is a fourplex considered a multifamily development. So the, I forget what we're calling them. We're not calling them the 40s anymore. That
We
area
don't
over
have
there.
a name for them, that's the problem.
Yeah, well, that area over
I
there.
still call it the 40s.
The library neighborhood.
The library
Ooh,
neighborhood.
That might be good.
Well, no, it's closer to the transit center than the library neighborhood, actually, is kind of my point. Is it 400? I mean, it's about 400, and we already have a parking problem there, so reducing the parking requirements for non-residential maybe, but not for multifamily.
Yeah, so I remember like the senior center that the commission didn't pass. It went to the city council on 38th Avenue. But the concern about that was parking for, I think, most of the commissioners who didn't approve that. But
No, it's because it was ugly.
so besides the subjective part about its aesthetic view,
Sorry.
there was concern about the parking, but one of the reasons I felt strongly about it was that it met the general plan. We're trying to encourage senior housing along that corridor where there's a transportation corridor, there's shopping there. So to me, I could see allowing some type of credit for that type of, multifamily or, higher density housing in an area like that was close to that transit area. But
Well, if we're talking about areas around this transit area that transit stop that are already impacted, and we're hearing that they're already impacted.
Right.
then are we really, I mean, aren't we going to, we're not serving the people in that area if we know they're already impacted, they're complaining about their parking, and we are now going to further, because most of those people, there's a parking spot for each one of those units, and they're not using that to go to work. You can't use the buses to go to work here in Santa Cruz County. It just doesn't work.
The other thing is that it says we may, so it doesn't say we should, and it doesn't say we shall, it says that we may.
Right.
We
I
may
mean,
issue a transit.
I can leave it there. I just bring it up because I think, and I think Gail brings up a good point. And I honestly haven't been able to figure this out. You know, what we have so many areas in our town that are already impacted by parking issues. And, you know, the trend is supposedly, well, we're supposed to provide, you know, less parking, so we'll make people walk somewhere.
Yeah,
And-
we'll make people walk.
We'll I mean, you're going to have to walk because there's no other choice. And I honestly can't sort of figure it out in my own mind. It's like, I don't want to be one of these people who says, no, we don't want any more new development, we don't want any intensification, but we have areas that are problem areas right now, and there's not a good way to sort of evolve that without making the situation worse. So, you know, I battle with that dilemma, like on the MUN neighborhood, which we'll talk about more, there's lots that can be done along there, but then you have to balance, there's already parking problems from what's there right now. And you say, well, we want to require less parking. How do we do that? I mean,
I see that there's two sides to it to me, because then there's the economic viability side of it. That's like, if we can increase opportunities for business, and the village is a good example, or even coming here, I'd say probably the majority of us walk here, or, except for tonight, I didn't walk.
I
tonight.
didn't.
But majority of us
I don't
probably-
did, none of us did tonight.
I always walk, but I
But we
didn't.
walk to the village, right? I mean, because we're in that neighborhood, and I think this encourages that and allows that opportunity to look at that. So I don't know that we're telling people they have to walk, but if we can put them close to transportation corridors or in these,
But we don't have
If we
it.
had good transportation, like a large city does, it would mean something, but it doesn't really mean anything now. When it takes an employee of mine from anywhere more than Capitola, if they want to take a bus, they have to transfer, and sometimes they could be on that bus for an hour and a half getting to me. It's crazy. It's not good. It's not a good system. And people aren't using it unless they are desperate. And the numbers are showing
the
that.
numbers are low, yes.
And I think this whole thing of trying to encourage people to get out of their cars is good, but when you're doing it and you know it's not going to work.
So again, how about this? It does say the planning commission may, so is it something that you feel like we have to take out, or can we leave it in there, and then we have that discretion when it comes in front of the planning commission?
You know, it's fine with me because it has the 400-foot limit in it to the regional transit center. So that's pretty close to it. You're probably only talking about, you know, the mall property itself. So, you know, I don't mind leaving it in there. I just think Gail's right. We have to be a little real about what we want in our zoning ordinance so that we don't make situations worse for the people in our town.
And we're not bringing solutions that work in larger communities into our community where we know they're, you know, this is not Berkeley, this is not anywhere over the hill because we don't have the same public transportation systems. You know, ours is pretty much failed. It's in a failure even though nobody really wants to say it. So,
Well, the only thing there is the bus, and it doesn't go to the right places, and
it takes forever to get where it does, it takes forever. So,
Right.
you know, I'm not so sure some of these things that apply in other communities apply here, and I think you're giving developers this wiggle room, this squeaking in, and you're either going to disappoint them, or you're going to have to bring a bunch of people out to say, not in my neighborhood, and we're kind of setting ourselves up, staff too, for more time spent on these things, and when we kind of know, I think it's true, I don't think it should be multi-unit use, I think multifamily, I think it should be for commercial use.
Okay, so
I
Jen,
would go with taking multifamily out.
I kind of still like it for the higher density areas. And
We're only talking about 400 feet from the mall, from the transit center in the mall.
so I think the corridor in the general plan where it talks about the higher density areas is that area. So
Yeah.
I hate to see us tie our hands by,
You know what's going to tie our hands is not what's written here. It's the fact that no one's ever going to build or move into housing that is going to use public transportation on 41st Avenue because it doesn't exist right now. It just doesn't exist. So, we've seen that with the villas. They're having a hard time, I think we are dreaming if we think someone's going to build and move into housing units on 41st Avenue, because we are not Silicon Valley, we are not San Francisco, we are not Berkeley, we don't have that kind of land use, we just don't have it.
The only way that I can see it happening is second homes, or like the 38th Avenue Senior Center when it was going to be, because then it makes sense for those people. They're not going to work. They're not riding the bus going places. They're walking to the mall, or they're maybe going to the theater, or they're maybe coming down here. They're not really doing it
Right.
in the big town. Then it might make sense for if someday the mall gets redesigned and becomes a walkable place with residential and, retail and commercial, and maybe down the road 20 years from now. But I agree with you completely. It's not any time on the horizon.
It's just, it all doesn't add up for us. This doesn't, it's a great idea.
So maybe you just say large multifamily development projects. So it doesn't include the fourplexes in the back 40s.
high density housing.
I have another suggestion. We could limit it to the area within, like, Claire's, 41st, and Capitola Road, so it's just the only for new development that occurs on the mall. That standard, if we were to have another transit center come into town at a different location, that would be problematic, but other than that, it would just limit that area within the mall redevelopment, which is pretty close to what the standard is. Ryan was looking at the zoning map, and there's a scale, and according to that scale, 400 feet goes to 41st Avenue.
Looks like it.
Or it crosses the street just to those commercial properties directly across, but it doesn't go into the residential area.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add to this discussion is that the zoning code is meant to implement the general plan, and we didn't propose any of this just because we thought that it would be fun to impose on Capitola, but because we were looking for ways to support and implement the general plan. And one of the things that the general plan calls for is sort of the long-term improvement, potential transformation of the Capitola Mall property for a more attractive destination for residents as well as visitors and shopping. And part of the way that you can make it more attractive destination is to increase the amount of activity and investment that occurs there, which could be supported by the addition of some residential uses or mixed use. And so this possible reduction within the vicinity of the transit corridor could provide some additional flexibility if there was a sort of residential or mixed-use component added to the mall that could be considered by the planning commission.
Thank you for saying that. So, yes, it will provide flexibility for someone who builds those units, and then those people will not use the transit, our public transit, and they will create more traffic for our community, which our community does not want. That's my point, is that, yes, if we had this transit, this would work, but we don't have it. And I don't think we're ever going to get it. I think that maybe I'm wrong, and Ben, you could tell us. I think for our types of communities, transit options are going down all over California, not just Santa Cruz County. I think for small coastal towns and not huge urban areas, transportation options are reducing, not increasing. Am I right or wrong?
No, I think you're right. I mean, I was just down in, sort of Cambria area, and they've almost completely eliminated all of their sort of transit because they can't afford to do it. Transit's a very expensive system to operate, and in small places like this, because of the ridership numbers and that, it just doesn't pencil out. But, on this particular one, there's actually a couple other reasons why I find this one difficult. We talk about projects within 400 feet of a regional transit center. There's talk about moving this transit center. So, do we let somebody build, because the transit center is on this side of the mall, and then we put it on the other side of the mall, and, the circle around where you can do this is sort of constantly changing. So, at this point in time, I would be happy to take out this particular discount because I don't think the transit center is a viable one. I think we've created a number of other opportunities for reducing parking and creating some flexibility, but this one just, doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
I would recommend the same thing, that we take it out, but also show the council that we took it out and give them the reasons, because of the moving, because of the low ridership, and then they can always put it back in.
Yeah.
I kind of take I would like to keep it in there, and I understand what you're saying, Gil. I think you're going to have an opportunity to vote on this ballot, because it's going to be on my understanding, a ballot about the regional transportation area, but I just
But it doesn't do much for the bus system.
Well, that's on the ballot, I guess, but I don't want to, I just hate to tie our hands. It all comes back to our discretion at the end of the day, the planning commission, so I just hate to see us tie our hands to something that the general plan is trying to work towards. It's just, and I like Katie's idea of
But
making this big.
We're doing plenty of other things. It's not like we're doing nothing. We're doing plenty of other things. I think we shouldn't do anything.
Or at least if we're going to keep it in here, then get rid of the 400 feet and go with what Katie said. Just say it for the mall parcel itself.
I could totally live with that area around the mall.
I get to see where having a potential for the discount could impact a development project coming in. And so limiting it to just that and leaving it in doesn't hurt us.
It only hurts because then a developer comes in and they decide to put in these units and we give them the credits for it. And then the people who use those units are spending so much in rent that they are not the kind of people who are going to use the transit system. They have cars and they're going to create more, we just don't have the kind of housing here in Capitola that's ever going to be for a person who uses the transit.
But that assumes the kind of development that winds up going into the mall is something that we've got in our mind today, and it might be completely different from that.
Yeah.
It might be.
We can always add it, too. I mean, if we take it out, it can always get added. Conversely,
it sort of takes an act of Congress to add stuff to the zoning code, though.
So do we want to just set this one aside and wait till Ed's here?
And have another whole different discussion on it?
We can, and a couple of things. We are also presenting to the Traffic and Parking Commission, I think next week, right, some of the parking changes. So, I mean, you'll have an opportunity to hear what that commission thinks of some of the proposals. And it also occurs to me, just listening to discussion, which I think is really good, it stimulates a little more thought in my mind, is I think if the mall were ever to do a comprehensive redevelopment, we'd have some kind of specific plan. We'd look at parking individually and outside of the concepts that we're talking about here. I think more likely where something like that would come into play is if more of an individual project came in to put a new pad on the frontage of 41st or Claire's or Capitola Road on the mall site, but, independent of a big redevelopment project. Because I think we'd handle that much differently. Just
I
something,
think,
food for thought.
maybe in order to really, I'd love to get transit numbers for Capitola. I'd kind of like to see who uses the bus and how many people use the bus and why they use a bus that get on and off here. I think we might be really surprised.
I know my niece used it when she came down from San Francisco. And she changed buses 3 times. I dropped her right at the mall, so I didn't have to go to downtown Santa Cruz to pick her up. I know. Bad me.
All right, so what are we doing?
Setting it aside.
I think we're going to
Notes
table
taken.
this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Notes taken?
Fees in lieu of parking. So this is consistent with the adopted city council policy. We have a policy for in lieu parking. Payments of in lieu fees must be to satisfy the on-site parking. There's also established criteria of what those fees are spent towards in the future for parking within the area. This is restricted to the mixed-use village zoning district only. It cannot be applied to residential uses. It's only non-residential uses, so commercial. And a in lieu parking plan would have to be approved by the city council where they're utilizing city spaces for that requirement.
Maybe we want to table this one also for Ed, because one of the items that we were going to look at tonight was this project across the street, and one of the options of that eliminate the on-site parking they had, and they would not be, according to this, the way it's currently written, they would not be able to use the
Ed won't participate in that discussion on,
in the.
he's conflicted out.
Oh, okay. Well, he's going to have a lot of conflicts, isn't he, in the village part of it, I guess, of that. But the in lieu parking, we're thinking about maybe making the village line up to Riverview Drive, right here at City Hall, and that's consistent with what the BIA uses as the village, and instead of down at, where we currently have it now.
It's at the trestle.
At the trestle, yeah.
So blue.
So so you're going to change that zoning along there, or? I mean, it
Well,
seems
that's a
like it's,
discussion. So if you're going to have these, so if the concept is these retail stores along Capitola Ave here, across from City Hall, is to be able to utilize in lieu parking if they're going to change, then that was just an option to allow. And that's what the BIA uses right now, is their line is Riverview.
And it just as a little bit of extra context, so the city council did adopt a in lieu parking fee program, I want to say about 2 years ago now. It's restricted currently to only a large village hotel that provides valet parking. A couple of council members did request that we bring that policy back. We're going to do that on March 24th, and I think at least a couple of members have interest in considering allowing other types of projects to potentially use it, whether it's outside the central village, maybe it's other types of uses. I'm not really sure, but there's some interest, and we discussed. So this right now is written relatively vague because we do have this policy in place. If the policy changes, we might want to codify what the council would adopt on
So
that.
should we
so
table
come
this
back
till
and
after?
revisit this after the council's had their discussions and.
I think that would probably be appropriate.
And do we know how many in lieu spots there are?
From memory, I want to say there's 57.
I've heard 100, I've heard 20, I've heard.
Now, it was based on, I think, the 2009 era parking study the city did, and they identified a deficit. The lower lot had, quote-unquote, a surplus of spaces over that deficit, and we designated those for future, a village hotel at this point that has valet service.
And I mean, this whole thing's just going to be battle royal anyway, so we should just wait. And there are a lot of people interested.
Okay.
Postal
it's wise.
Commission as well.
Postal Commission, at least when we did the policy, we talked to them, and they didn't have any strong objections. When it goes in the code, maybe they'll view it differently, but, or if we tried to expand it, maybe they would
Yeah,
view
are
it
you talking about
differently.
in lieu parking specifically, or is that?
No, I think there's going to, my guess is there might be a debate with them about how many extra spaces the city's claiming it has in the lower parking lot that the city thinks they're going to be able to sell.
Very possible.
Okay, the next item is incentives for community benefits. This is page 88-1 through 88-2. This is a new chapter to define what a community benefit is, as listed on actually, Rich is pulling it up right now, so 88-1. Tied to the incentives, the available incentives are for an increase in maximum floor area to a floor area ratio of 2, and was set in the general plan. Second is an increase in height. Within the current zoning code, you're allowed to do an increase in height within the CC zone, but there's no maximum established, so this actually creates a maximum to the height at 50 feet. In comparison, the CC floor area ratio right now within the zoning code, the draft zoning code is a 1, and within the regional commercial is 1.5. Height is established in both zones at 40 feet. So,
And just as context, we've had plan development projects, and certainly when we went through the process with the general plan to define the circumstances by which additional floor area ratio could be increased, we got into the discussion of, well, what's really a community benefit that we should consider? Because as you recall, with plan developments, it's really loose right now. So this was our attempt to try to define it better, set some standards and limitations. We're not sure we got it right. Some might be good, and I think you'll probably have some good additions. So that was the genesis of this section.
So I'm a little confused about, we say the city may grant incentives, so fronting on 41st Avenue or 41st Avenue in Capitola Road intersection in the regional commercial, so only part of the regional commercial, and then anything in the CC zoning district. I was sort of wondering how we came up with that. I mean, I was thinking it was going to be in the CR district and the CC, not just part of the CR district.
I would have to cross-reference the general plan. Those standards were set when we adopted the general plan. My recollection is that we wanted to extend it along 41st Avenue, but we did recognize that the intersection there with Capitola Road, where it transects to community commercial, would also be an area where we'd want to consider where the gas stations are, those parcels. But primarily it was from Capitola Road north, and then those intersection parcels.
So it's this, not all of this, right?
No, because it says, and the community commercial zoning district.
Ben just suggested, which I like, is we could put a little map in the zoning code so it's very clear what areas that would apply
I was just
to.
confused by,
Yeah, because you're not including the whole CC, right? You're
Just
right.
including this area
Intersection.
right here?
Yeah.
At the intersection.
Now, one part that I've since looked at since adoption and have wondered is, the areas that don't front 41st Avenue on the mall site, maybe it's on Claire's and it's a block away. To me, that seems like you might want to consider it as well, but as it's currently written, it doesn't. That might be a topic for another day, but.
I would consider the entire CR and just the front on Capitola Road across the street.
The concern that we had with the general plan with doing the whole CR was particularly on the east side of 41st Avenue. You have a lot of those parcels that abut residential uses. And I believe we set a standard that it had to have at least 100-foot separation.
Right.
So if you wanted to, say, replace the Wells Fargo bank at the corner, you could do it there, but if you wanted to take out Whole
Trader
Foods,
Joe's or-
you'd have to give a little bit more separation.
Yeah.
So we did have some limits there in the CR zone.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. But the Claire's side of the, around the mall property.
Yeah, that's not covered under the general plan as it's written.
And the CC does have some housing plan development in the back of it too, so that's got a little bit of, on the east side of the CC district, has got some of those same restrictions
Right.
that the east side of 41st Avenue has, so we're,
But are we, so I'm clear, we're just talking at the CC part at the intersection of Capitola Road and 41st, fronting
Right.
41st Avenue. So it's the two gas stations.
so it's,
Right.
okay.
That's all we're
So it's
talking
going-
about.
And
it's
there's
going
also the
south.
provision in the village. And I believe there it goes from 2 to 3 if you meet certain specified criteria and provide community benefit.
But that's in another section and different from this, because this one is for,
Right.
Yeah,
this
CC.
one is simply for this area.
Well, the allowable benefits, I think, still apply. Your recollection?
Building
I'll pull
height
up
of
the
50
general
feet.
plan.
I think the village is a whole different animal.
Right, in the village, there's some incentives and findings, but they're different
They're
than this
separate, yeah.
particular program here.
Yeah, this is meant to be just for 41st Avenue.
Right.
That's how I recall that, is just the 41st.
So I'd like to talk about some of the specific incentives. G, the pedestrian and bicycle facilities. For me, I'm not sure that warrants more square footage and higher buildings to that extent up. And also, public art, we've already got an ordinance that talks about public art, so how are we going to add, how would this be applied here then?
So it would be something that's above and beyond, and I think that's clarification we'll need to make. I think we did with one of the other standards, escapes me right now. But yeah, it would have to be going above your current requirements. And it's probably good to specify that, just providing one of these, the minimal contribution to the community is probably not adequate.
No.
It's
Because
gotta
they
be
have to do that.
substantial.
We've ordinanced them to
Right.
do that.
Yeah.
And defining substantial, I think, is very challenging. There's probably got to be some subjectivity that we have in this section, setting standards, but to measure I don't know how to do that.
And I didn't, public parking structures, structured parking made permanently available for public use. Is that not going to be parking that's going to be used for businesses? I mean, I just think we need to sort of clarify these a bit more.
Where were you reading from?
H, public parking
Oh, got it.
structures. Structured parking made permanently available for public use. Well,
Meaning if they build a parking structure, then they get,
Then I have a third car and I don't have room for it in my garage and I can put it
park
there?
it in there and leave it there? I mean, what are,
I don't know, the way I envision this is back to that general plan to redo that corridor where the mall is now, that's how I envision that may come about, is if there's some type of facilities there that we'd encourage them to put public parking to it.
I
Right,
see
one
it
of
as like in Santa Cruz, next to the MA, the Museum of Art and History, there's that great parking garage that goes up floor, but there you're paying for it. You're not going to spend, keep there, but it's public parking. Anyone can utilize it, but you've provided public parking on site that can be utilized by others in the.
I think anybody who's
so
willing to
it's
come
more
in and put in
parking
a
than
structure.
you needed to provide.
Mm-hmm.
Publicly available parking, not just for your customers
Okay, and
or
it's not
employees.
necessarily free parking. It's-
Or for your extra car.
So it's above and beyond what you normally would have to required for your retail development.
Right.
Like if I needed to provide 100 spaces for my
Right.
retail development, I'm going to provide 150 spaces, I'm going to give 50 spaces for public parking.
I think it
But
should
it's-
say in addition
but
to
it's-
required parking.
Yeah.
But that's not what we're trying to incent. What we're trying to incent is a redevelopment of the mall lot, right? So if somebody comes in and says, okay, we're gonna put in a new store along the front, and we're gonna build a parking structure so that we can do away with some of this surface parking, they shouldn't have to be penalized and add a bunch more parking to it, because the cost of the structure is gonna be huge.
But they shouldn't be given something because they are doing it.
If they're
But they should, because the
clients, if
benefit
their
is,
customers are going to be using all of that parking, and we say it's open to the public, but they're building a large enough building that that's going to be used for they're being incented for something that they're not really
We
providing.
already give them a benefit on the mall, on number C, that, if the mall's going to come in and do those kinds of things, we will consider giving them extra height and square footage. That you sort of deal with in number C. So beyond the mall, I just think these need to be worked on a bit and beefed up, and it needs to show that it's something above and beyond what they would have been doing anyway.
I've seen a standard like this before where it's a dedication of land for future public parking. So if, that they're actually giving to the city for a future public parking.
I'm not sure we have room for that.
But even at
In
the
any
mall or
place
anywhere,
on
yeah.
the mall property or anywhere else.
So I guess I have a question for the commission. If you look on page 88-1, section 020, and this statement here about incentives being available only for amenities that are not otherwise required by the zoning code or other provision of local, state, or federal law. So in other words, going above and beyond the minimum requirements. Is that sufficient to address your concerns? No.
I think it needs to be addressed in sort of the individual statements. Like on public art, I think, we need to say public art beyond what is typically required for these kinds of projects. I mean, if we're going to, pedestrian and bicycle facilities, enhanced beyond what you would normally get. Because if someone came in, we would get pedestrian bicycle facilities. We would get public art. We would get a parking structure that, people can park in. It's public parking. So
We also have to look at what they're getting for these things, and is this a good exchange? In other words, I'm sorry to say I don't know where we were for floor area ratio. We're now suggesting that they can get up to 2. Were we at 1.5? I thought we were up to 2 in some situations.
It's in the general plan that we adopted, that they can have this increase under certain circumstances, and at the time, we left it vague, and said it had to provide substantial community benefit.
But what's the norm there? Is it 1.5?
It's in the CC it's 1, and in the regional it's 1.5.
1.5. So that's a lot. We're giving them a lot of square footage. And my feeling is that just for bicycles, that's not a good enough, because you have to have bike things anyway, and how many times are they completely full on 41st Avenue? So I'm not sure that just bicycles and pedestrian is enough for me, and I think the public art would have to go way above and beyond, because depending on let's say they're doing a $7 million upgrade or building, they're going to have to put in $700,000 or something, if they, I can't remember, I never remember whether it's the 1 or 2%. They have to put in a $700,000 piece of artwork, or they have to put in $140,000 into our thing. So are we going to double that artwork? And is another $140,000 really worth giving them another 0.5 in floor area ratio? No, it's not.
and one of these things,
I just see
Maybe
these
they
are,
need to aggregate them.
to me, I see these are just what's allowed within that.
So there can be a mix, and also I'll draw to your attention under findings, 17.880080. Under C, the benefit of the proposed amenities to the community is commensurate with the economic value of the requested incentives. So that's part of your valuation. So if they were just coming in with like really beautiful bicycle racks and a new bike path, at that point you could say, well, for the extra 0.5 floor area ratio, we really want to see X, Y, and Z incorporated into the program. And
I think we could clarify
I
this
just
more.
think
The way
they
this
just need to be rewritten a bit so it's a fit.
Yeah, I think we get the message. I don't think that any of us or any reasonable person would say, well, you gave 1% over your public art fund, so we're going to give you more building. But defining what is that magic number, I think, is going to be really challenging. So I think at the end of the day, we're still going to have something subjective, but I think we can tighten it up and say that maybe there's major types of contributions versus minor ones where you really need multiple things. I don't know.
And I always remember these being negotiable, like, and I know this is not so much in Capitola because we're pretty much built out, but in areas where developers want to come in and build it, we say, okay, this is fine, but you have to give us 75 acres of open space or, whatever it's going to be. It's all negotiable at the end of the day, right? If they want a project, these are the things that we can negotiate with to.
It's not all negotiable.
It's similar to the way the city would approach a development agreement with an applicant. I think the intent is to identify sort of a menu of amenities that are desired by the community, supported by the general plan. That's where this list came from, is the policies that are in the general plan. This is the menu of community amenities that are valued by residents. And so an applicant who would want to request additional height or FAR would propose a package of amenities and would need to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the Planning Commission that these amenities are commensurate to the value of the incentive that they would be getting. And so I think that was the intent, and it seems like maybe that wasn't communicated clearly in this, and we could clarify that.
This needs stronger language.
That was a well-worded thing.
And I would also contrast it with currently the plan development. I think the provision of jobs is something that could allow the city council to authorize a plan development permit. So we wanted to get something that was a little more tangible than, well, you opened a business,
So how long are we going to go tonight?
Midnight?
we're halfway there.
Whenever we've adequately fatigued you.
Or we, you.
So we got to basically where I thought we were going to get if we decided to stop now. But I still want to have the conversation because now that we've actually done it,
So are we all in agreement? We want to stop at 9 o'clock now? Is this a good time to stop and then?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, and then, so we can have a dialogue.
we can have the
about
dialogue
process.
first, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Because we see how long it's going to take to do this. My question is, when we did the original plan and we had that one meeting with city council, and we identified the 18 issues that we were really going to, beat around and talk about, it was really helpful in guiding us and going the right direction. Of those, I think staff has found these 12 that they really think we need to talk about because we're going to have this kind of dialogue. So I just want to go back and revisit, starting at the beginning of the book and going through in that order. Are we going to get sucked down a rabbit hole and wear ourselves out before we cover the important ones? Or can we try and cover the ones that we think are going to be an issue, identify policies, and have a joint meeting with council to do the top 4 policy questions?
For me, I think a lot is going to depend on the list that comes out on the 17th. I went through here and I have all of these tabs in here, and a lot of them are, sort of minor word things that we can get through. At some point, I think we owe it to the public, because as confusing as it has been for us to jump around and do it this way, we need to, say, okay, we're going to talk about, these first 6 sections of the zoning ordinance. And if we get a lot of our sort of minor things dealt with, it seems like it shouldn't take a whole lot of time. I think we can go through it fairly quickly, But at some point, I think we have to sort of go through the document so we can say to our public, we did talk about every part of it, not just bits and pieces of
And I
it.
do remember that we picked out the harder things when we had the first go-around with the proviso that we were going to go through the whole thing when it came to us, so that, because there are, some changes here and there, and I don't think we would be doing the public a service by allowing, and I love our staff. I think our staff's done a great job, Ben. It's a great document. It's so much better. But I don't think we'd be doing them a benefit by not reviewing it in public.
Oh, no, I'm not supposing that we don't do that. I'm just saying, should we get through the hard ones first? And then maybe we're making a lot of changes to the draft. Maybe when we get the rewritten draft, then we go beginning to end, and then we won't have so much of this kind of discussion, which would have let them do
We
it.
were going to get another whole rewritten draft. We're going to get another whole rewritten draft? And
Yeah.
at what point will that happen?
Yeah, I think the idea is, our initial thought was we'd go through, we'd take a lot of the changes that we thought were really substantial and policy-driven, not the clarifications, not the things that we thought we heard consensus on when we went through issues and options. But given the commissioners and the city council later opportunities to pick out other things that are concerned, and we'd address those, and as we make changes based on direction, we'd update the document, redline it. I don't know if we'll produce a lot of hard copies, but certainly put it on the website. If you want hard copies, we can accommodate that. But so that was the idea, that we would track our changes as we move through the process.
And then, what was your process going with the city council? Something similar to this, or just taking them to?
I will ask them for some direction on how they want to handle it. I think based on how the planning commission goes through it may have some effect with that as well. As I mentioned earlier, if we need a lot meetings and or extended period of time, I may try to roll them in to that process so that they don't go dark with it. But that's a discussion I need to have with them as well.
So whether we go through, all of the salient points now, the harder points now, and then, I don't mind which way we do it. I just think we need to, at some point, go through the whole document. And to me, it seems, I don't know what's faster. I know Susan's had a lot of changes, and maybe it's beneficial to make those changes first, and then we start going through the whole document so that we can see the changes that have already been made.
Well, I think the list of, your changes and her changes and his changes and my changes and Ed's changes, that list is going to hopefully give us more of a guide, but I don't think we want to, we're going to get sucked down into the weeds if we talk about all of them. We just go,
Well,
That's
whether or not
public process.
Whether or not we get sucked down in the weeds, at some point, we have to go through it, and we have to talk about each section of it. And maybe it's, that, we start and, we say we're going to talk about the Central Village, and we're going to talk about, the multi-use neighborhood district, and we're going to go so far through it, or we're going to take it by section. We're going to talk about the zoning districts,
I think that also makes it easy for people to know when they want to come to these meetings, because if you're bouncing around, you've got people like tonight talking about all kinds of different things that, I'm not sure that people even knew why they were here tonight, and I think if you're saying, we're going to talk about the village tonight, and that's pretty much all we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about everything having to do with the village, you're going to get more people here knowing what they're going to talk about.
but if you
So
talk,
I'm okay with that, but I think when you say you're going to talk about everything that's with the village, it's going to make you jump around. 'cause it's
Yeah,
not
it
all
is.
one.
That's the point, we're
that's-
just going to jump around
It
differently.
is.
Yeah. So that's what.
It is. But that kind of jumping around really, to me, makes more sense because we're talking about one topic rather than
And then when we- I
five
guess-
different topics in one night that are almost completely unrelated. That just doesn't, I think people were confused.
I think if you do I don't know when you do it, but the MUN and the MUV is a big one. The village is a big one. And, you can put them together that way, but then temporary sidewalk dining is going to get lost somewhere.
Your list goes
And I,
from start to end.
I think the staff is.
I'm just, how we're doing it right now, I think is confusing, for us at times, and from, what comments I hear from the public, it's very confusing for them. They sort of feel like we're trying to do some sort of card game where, shell game that, people don't really know what's going on or what's happening.
When
So
you're
can-
talking
I think we
about
need to
4 or
counter
5
that.
different unrelated topics in one night,
So I think I hear some of the concerns. I think we could probably come up with a better approach to it and try to organize the hearings more in concert with the way the code is laid out. But I think some of the comments I heard point on that, for instance, so if next time or the next meeting we start with zoning districts and overlay zones, we get into residential zoning districts, there's no way to avoid the fact that we're going to start looking at height, floor area ratio, setbacks, standards that are set in another chapter. So I think to some extent, there's going to be an inevitability that we're going to do some jumping.
absolutely.
But we could certainly follow kind of the structure, the way it's organized in the code today.
Because I think that kind of jumping is going to actually teach people how to use this document. Because that's what they're going to have to do when they come in with an application. So you're actually reinforcing the way this document is used by doing that. By doing it that way, using a section, talking about a section, and showing all the different places it is.
Yeah.
So my question would be, and I like the idea we're going with this, so if we take a section, is staff going to put together where those sections may be applicable, where they are in other sections? Or is that something that you want us, when we start going to do our study and we find out
Well,
where
it
other
sh-
references are? Is it, how would you?
It should be in here, because the way I understand it is there should be, like if I'm looking up something in the MUV zoning district and then I have parking questions, there's supposed to be a reference number that takes me to where I find that information. And so another thing that will do is it'll be a good test of making certain that everything does work.
Yeah, right. That what you expected to be in that reference section is really there, and it really relates to this.
We can give it a shot, and, if we don't like it at the next hearing, we can circle the wagons and,
Thank you
And
for being.
know.
personally, I think it's going to be faster than what we're doing right now.
okay.
the only other comment I heard that I'd like to clarify, I think Commissioner Smith said, take in Commissioner Westman's comments, put them into the document now. How I'd rather do that, at least with a substantive request, is have the commission see them before staff makes changes, because
Yeah.
maybe the other 3 or 4 don't agree.
Yeah,
And I
for
don't
me,
want
it's
to chase
the
that.
list.
but-
It's
Yeah.
the list of everybody's issues that
Now,
we
the
all
minor
need to
ones,
see them.
we can probably just make if it's, you got the wrong word,
I mean, like
spelling,
changing
typo.
valet parking,
Yeah.
that was
I learned what an
those are
arcade was.
easy ones.
Yeah,
Yeah,
changing the driveway width from 10 to 20.
right.
Is
There's a
kind of
clear
an obvious
mistake.
one that we need to know is changing, so it should be on the list, but yeah, we don't have to talk about it, because everybody obviously can.
So
So, okay, so systematically, the way I started reviewing the thing was to start with a section and go through, and you get to a table, and it references these additional regulations. I was popping over, and so I was doing sections that way. Is that what you guys are talking about?
because that's what an applicant's going to have to
Right.
do.
Okay.
Yeah. And so if people are coming here and they're watching us do this, that's going to inform them, educate them on how to use this document.
And we're going to start that with part 2?
Before I commit to it, I want to give it a little bit more thought, but at least initially, I think, we might start from page 1 a little bit, we put this user guide in there, how's it organized and formatted, and talk a little bit about enactment applicability. I think those would be very brief discussions. And then, we'll get in the purpose and effect and kind of go down the list.
And I think it's important to do some of this, not because we're critical of what the staff has done, but it's like you almost need it to, they know, I've done this, and when you do it, you know what you're doing and where you're going with it. And sometimes a person who's not engaged in it doesn't know where it's going and how it's working. And so we need a document that will work for people who come in cold. And
Well, I started at part 3, which was the citywide stuff, because I figured if I can get the citywide stuff and figure that out, then go back into the individual zones, because a lot of the citywide stuff does call out the individual zones. But
see what, yeah.
you want to start with the individual zones.
And I don't know whether, I mean, like, one of the things for me is, I think that all commercial that abuts up to a residential needs to do a daylight study. And right now, we have that in some of our zoning requirements, some districts, and in some places, but we don't have it in others. It's like, I don't understand why, if you're doing commercial along Capitola Avenue, which abuts up to residential, why you don't do sort of the same daylight study that you're going to do in other districts where commercial abuts up to a residential. So there's some things that I think need to be consistent throughout the document. I mean, the impact of building a commercial building next to a residential is the same as if you're if you're on Capitola Road, or if you're on Capitola Avenue, or if you're building next to the housing that's on 42nd. So I would like to see some consistency in how we approach that, you know, all residents deserve to have that if you're backing up to a commercial district. So I don't think you can just go to the citywide standards and say, you know, I wouldn't start there, I would start here, and maybe some of these things need to be in the citywide standards. Does that make any sense?
Okay. All right.
I just wanted to bring up one other thing that just, it kept coming up for me reading this, and that is that I just don't know how our staff, given the numbers that we have now of staff, how you're going to handle the additional administrative applications that are called out for in the ordinance. There seem to be a lot of administrative permits, more than we have now. And it just seems to me as though we're going to need more staff to do that. How are you guys going to, you're already overloaded. How are you going to?
I don't think there really are many new development types that require permits that don't today. I think that.
Signage, I mean, there's, you know.
So we do all those today.
We have to do it for the planning commission anyway.
Right, so right now, signs generally, almost all with the planning commission. So by the ability to issue an administrative permit over the counter, it's a reduction in staff
All right,
effort.
so you're feeling like you're not going to have to add staff for this?
No, I think if anything, it's going to streamline in a lot of cases and hopefully will reduce our workload in a lot of cases. There might be some areas where, you know, we've identified a deficiency and we're putting standards on, and it will require more time, more study. But in the balance, I think it'll be helpful.
You survived night number 1.
Yeah,
Maybe.
certainly.
And so when is the next meeting?
March 17th, 2 weeks from tonight.
And we'll have the list of
St.
our own
Patty's Day.
stuff to review quickly, and we'll have our list all combined
Smile.
I know.
a week before.
This lucky young man.
And you'll identify which chapters will be a topic of discussion for the 17th.
Is
Yeah,
there
we'll set
a way to
agenda.
sort them so that
Which we need,
the
I'm
list of
sorry.
comments starts,
Oh, I was going to
moves
ask,
through?
In order.
They don't jump
Yep.
around?
Yep, they are in order by the code. Yep.
I believe I do need a formal
Continuance.
Continuance.
motion to continue it to the 17th.
Yeah. I'll second that.
the first and a second, all those in favor?
Aye.
Then we'll adjourn, but I did have one
Wait,
question.
don't
Is-
adjourn. I've
Oh,
got
I'm sorry.
something else I want to
Oh,
say.
okay. Is there a staff question? Is it available electronically?
It is. It's on
Yeah, it's on the website.
the city website.
Oh, so you can do searches on it
Yeah.
that way instead of, okay.
This didn't have a
'Cause
vote.
that, to me, it just seems like it'd be easier to do word searches and then,
If you have any problem finding, I can send you the link, but hopefully it's easy to find.
It's easy to find.
Okay.
It's easy to find.
So I have a comment that's not on the ordinance review, and it has to do with Brian, and so I'm hoping you can listen to this too. I think Orchard Supply is still putting stuff out all the time, and they do it on the weekends. I can't remember what we allowed them, but my recollection is when you're facing the building, we only allowed them a little bit on the left-hand side of the door. They've got things in the parking lot still sometimes. They've got things on the right of the door. It's all over the place. You know, they are back at it.
We did give them some flexibility during their construction period. We recognized that it was, a challenging period for them, but we'll go out and
That's
look.
over, and I
Yep.
know that, and that's
As a
over.
grand opening is, if you looked in the sky, I think we all knew when they
Yeah.
opened their doors.
They've got things on the right. They had barbecues out there. They had outdoor heaters out there on the right. It's just all over the place.
And I think as a commission, we made a little bit of a mistake in not dealing with the back area of Orchard Supply that fronts on to 38th Street there, because their delivery area and all of that is pretty much a mess, and it's unfortunate that we didn't put some conditions on them about sort of cleaning up or screening some of that area, but we didn't.
We'll follow up.
Thank you.
Question, general plan, is there a way to get a hard copy of the final general plan?
I do have a few copies remaining. If you'd like, I can give
get
you one.
please?
Yeah.
Mine is so chicken scratched, and I can't figure out what we wrote. And for the 17th, I'm going to keep my hard copy package, so you don't need to give me another one, just the zoning stuff.
Okay.
That'll make it harder or easier.
And we're going to start at 6 o'clock again and go to, and then would we continue it? So those of us who won't be, we'll just wait around for this to be talked about and then come back.
Do you all want to hold on to your exhibit for the 17th for across the street?
Yeah, I've got my stuff for the 17th
That's not
across
going to
the
change,
street.
right? So,
I'm not going to.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, otherwise,
We don't need new stuff for the 17th.
Yeah, no.
Very good.
now I can adjourn?
Hey, can we adjourn the meeting
You
now?
can adjourn the meeting, thanks.
Healthy discussion.